All right. So we're back again with myself and,
Steve.
yeah, Craig's had some family stuff to do. So we're going to start out talking a little bit about what's happening with COVID, and then we're going to talk about the replicatability crisis, which Steve is significantly more of an expert on, but maybe I can put it into real people terms if we need to. So anyway, just
That's
before we got
always
on
useful.
here, well, that's the plan, or the hope at least. But just before we got on here, we were talking about the vaccines that are looking to come out, and there's a third that's just gone into phase 3 trials. There's either 5 or 6 that are in late stages right now, and according to not so much leaks as information that was given out to the governors of the states that they need to start preparing for a possible widespread rollout of a vaccine, potentially at the end of October, beginning of November. Um, the totality of that is basically just, get your infrastructure ready, get your people ready, do what you need to do for this. We're going to try and get it out to you. That's about all I've got on that. There's not a whole lot of information. It's kind of just an early thing. And then on that same note, it's still just early September here. This being recorded on the, 6th. So, that's fully 2 months out, realistically. And
Yeah, and
as
there's a
fast as
lot of
things are
stuff
moving
that
right now,
happens.
yeah,
A
a
lot of stuff
lot,
that happens.
lot can. And, in that same note, the Russian vaccine work that's going through right now is also showing a lot of progress. But I thought we'd discuss that real quick and maybe share our thoughts. So
Sure.
please, go right ahead, because we were talking about something beforehand. I'd love for you to continue.
There's a couple different things. One is, I would caution anybody who's sitting there and hoping that we're going to see a vaccine anytime soon. I know that different people have different views on the politics of the situation. Some folks believe that the whole crisis will be over, end of the election, and I suspect I kind of lean that way a little bit too.
At least to some
Um,
degree, that's,
yeah,
I mean, if we're going to be
I think the
completely honest
craziness
with
will
each
be.
other, well, not even with each other, if you and I, are being completely honest with anyone that might ever listen to this,
Yep,
yeah, it's kind of gonna fade a little bit, no matter what happens,
yep,
because the issue isn't as useful.
right. And so I think that there is going to be this tremendous push to talk about it. But I would, obviously, would it be nice to have a vaccine? I am, yes, but I'm also somewhat suspicious as to whether we will actually end up seeing it, because when we start talking about drug development pipelines, that's a really long process, a lot longer than a lot of people think it is, just because of the amount of effort that has to go into to researching these things and verifying these things and checking them. So, to if they're talking about entering their phase 3 trials, doing human trials at this point, you have to give the vaccine to them, and I don't think that they're going to be giving a live virus to these people, right? So you're basically going to be doing an inference on this vaccine
Actually,
to see whether it's a effective.
let me bust in on you on that. I have seen that they are going to be doing some live virus studies.
Are they? I
They
thought
are.
that was
Well, there's
that's
some
typically locked
regulatory
out and
hurdles that
unethical.
have been kind of eliminated for the current situation.
That's interesting.
Indeed, it
That's
is. It's,
very
I mean, it's
interesting.
obviously, an entirely opt-in thing, but from my understanding, there are actually going to be legitimate human trials in putting people in legitimate danger. But
That
if a
is
person does
that's
give informed consent, then
uh,
that's the gold
sure,
standard.
sure, absolutely. I don't disagree, but that's been kind of banned for a large number of decades.
It's bold.
That's a practice that we've explicitly not done for a really long time.
It
So
is a bold maneuver, but I mean,
if
we are in bold times, you might say.
if they can pull it off, power to them. But the second concern that I have with the COVID vaccine is there seems to be a lot of evidence popping out that seems to indicate that it's not particularly effective, or specifically that immunity isn't effective. Either the virus is mutating too quickly, or that we're actually losing immunity, and we're getting people who have the virus, who left and were cured for all intents and purposes, and months later are going back in and finding that they have it again. So
Now, on
the
that,
efficacy of the vaccine is
I would like to note on that I mean, yeah, the efficacy of the vaccine is actually absolutely paramount. But on that, what we are seeing in a lot of those cases, I've noted, is that they are picking up secondary strains. I don't think we've seen a person sick with the same strain.
Well, but that's the point, right? A vaccine is not developed for multiple strains. It's only developed for the one strain the vaccine is developed for. So whether it's the virus is mutating or whether it's people aren't actually holding their immunity, it doesn't really matter.
Numbers I'm hearing on that are the most current information I heard was at least 4 months. So figure
something
4 or
like
5.
that, yeah.
Which is up from the 3 of a previous study. So, I mean, everything, I'll take any good news I can get, but that's not a tremendous amount of time.
But think about this for a moment, right? So if you want to use the vaccine as a predominant control method, and we have these as legitimate concerns, which they do appear to be, that means that you would have to have enough vaccine built, prepared, and stabilized to administer it to every single person within the nation within 4 months. That is a tall order. So we may end up having a situation where we have a vaccine that even if it does work on one strain, it doesn't work on all strains. And, if we are, that's problem A. And problem B is if it doesn't actually last, then we basically need to provide immunity to enough people instantaneously to hit the herd immunity threshold such that the virus stops spreading before our immunity decreases. So I'm kind of skeptical of the vaccine in that regards.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to require one way or the other, it's going to require a scaled rollout.
Yes.
I mean, it's not something you can just do. I mean,
right.
I guess you could, but that's a taller order even than what you're describing in and of itself. Because, I mean, you got to put infrastructure in place that it doesn't exist.
Right.
To put it simply. I mean, there is infrastructure there, but not for anything at this scale. We're not built to do medicine for this many people.
No.
This fast.
No. I mean, you start talking about the our birth rate has come down to be roughly equivalent to the number of people in the population. So we're basically holding our population steady with minor increases, which means that on average, over the course of like 18 years, there's 360 million kids that we have to vaccinate en masse, right? And obviously you have the anti-vaxxers, and that's a separate issue. But that is a very different, having 18 years of scale to kind of get that in there, and having to do 360 million people within 4 months is a whole unique characteristic and problem that we just have never had to do before. So I am skeptical.
I mean, that's completely reasonable. I'm hopeful because, I mean, we have the brightest minds in the world working together to solve this problem. So, I mean, you really couldn't ask for a better set of circumstances for something like this to happen. I mean, even 10 years ago, it would be an entirely different situation. So, there is something to be said for it. But, nonetheless, it's just, it is what it is, as they say.
Right. I mean, I agree, right? It's always good to be hopeful. But, I think anybody who is banking solely on this, it would be a poor choice to bank only on this, or to think that this is going to end just because the vaccine rolls out. And again, I think the politically useful component is going to be a larger role than we think. So even if we did manage to meet all of those technical challenges, I think you still face a political challenge with this disease that we haven't really seen with any of the other diseases.
Well, right off the bat, I mean, we have Officer Harris's comments on that just, I believe, yesterday or today, where she was very skeptical of taking anything that Mr. Drumpf would, provide to her. So that is a concern that we'll have. Sometimes advocates of the police state, they have thoughts like this, and you have to be wary of people like that. People are going to make up their own minds.
Right. And that's, I mean, you look at some of the stuff that we faced with the drug development and what cures are politically acceptable and what's not. I hold my skepticism
laid bare lately. It really has. I mean, I've not in all my days seen anything of the like.
Right. So my, I know that there's a lot of people out there who are calling it a plandemic, and I kind of understand that as more of a, it seems that there's a lot of people who are taking political advantage of the situation, and because
Undoubtedly.
it is a politically convenient thing, we're having a little bit of an overreaction, is generally what I'm hearing from most people. And when we start talking about that being the case, uh, then what is the likelihood that it's going to go away just because we do have something like a vaccine? Especially if we're talking about the vaccine being, having immunity issues and all of these other things. And if all of a sudden we do have something and it, none of these crazy schemes need to be used, then who's to say that there's not going to be a solid push against it? Somebody's going to find some sort of, archaic, terrible data set that shows that it's horribly dangerous. And this is what we've been dealing with this whole time. So I don't expect any changes there.
No. Everything is part of it.
Politicians will meet expectations. I'll put it that way.
They will not fail to meet our. Well, I don't know.
We can
there's
set
some
that
people,
bar low, and they manage to find a way.
There are some people who will actually be surprised at politicians, but I know I won't because they.
Yeah.
Well, a thing that doesn't have a soul will do all sorts of fascinating things. It's like a computer without programming. It can just go wild.
Well, it's kind of weird. So I repair TVs on the side. I do my nuclear engineering by day, and I'm a terrible Batman at night, where I go off and I fix people's televisions. And one of the guys I fixed was a New York district attorney, does training for the judges in the state, and he said that he when he was a DA or an assistant DA or whatever he was, right, he really liked the job. At least a lot better than when he had to go work for the governor's office, because at least when you're talking to the the murderers, the rapists, and the pedophiles, they're honest as compared with the politicians. So it was an interesting take, right? Yeah, right. So
well, I mean, when you're around slime balls all day anyway, at least you can say, hey, at least these slime balls are honest.
Well, what he was saying, right, is that they have their own, that you talk about the criminal mind. And the criminal mind rationalizes its behavior, and that there's some truth to that rationalization. Not that it's an actual true thing, not that it's not horrible what they did, but that there is some internally consistent aspect of what these people are doing. Whereas when you go with a politician, they don't have any sort of internally consistent logic, perverse or otherwise. It's whatever popular opinion or whatever might be to their advantage to take advantage of. And that makes it, kind of feeling slimy every time you have to deal with them.
Yeah, I mean, and if I'm going to be honest, I mean, we are joking around a little bit about this, but I mean, it's not all that jokey, and it's not all that untrue, because I mean, really, these are some soulless motherfuckers.
Well, we had a great opportunity to try to come together, and we didn't.
Yeah.
It was really laid bare how divisive the discourse is in the country. One person turns around and says, hey, this might be a really cool thing. I hope this works out. And just because, that person happens to be persona non grata, all of a sudden we see within a week a dozen different articles written about the dangers of this drug that's been around for 70 years that people are on routine treatment for. And you're like, come on now. This is not like a new thing. It's not like a surprise, right?
I love that they their final thing, the last thing they had to fall on was, well, what about the people with lupus? What about those people with lupus and arthritis? What if they don't get their drugs? It's like, really?
Yeah, right. So we've come full circle from this is a dangerous drug and will kill everybody in the United States to, well, there's these people who take it routinely and it's dangerous if they don't take it. And you're like, okay. You gotta pick a lane, buddy.
Yeah, 1-800,
I don't care which lane you pick, but pick a lane.
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
yeah,
it's exasperating. I mean, to be fully honest, I mean, it's if you follow politics and the intersection. Honestly, if you follow politics and the intersection of intersectionality, it will tire you half to death.
Oh yes.
But
It is
I don't
exhausting.
want to go too deep into that rabbit hole because that's a whole thing in and of itself, and
It is.
I don't have the patience to deal with it at this exact moment in time. I'll deal with it
Uh,
when the world has a little bit more hope, and I'm not, you know, taking a peek at that Damocles sword, chilling out.
mm.
So we'll worry about a little bit more petty things when there's time to be petty. Right now, we've got a human race to save.
Indeed.
So we'll, I mean, oh yeah, I guess I'll real quickly go over these so that people can be aware. I'll link the one from CIDRAP. It's the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy out of the University of Minnesota. That's got this recent update. It's from like 5 days ago. But anyway,
Hey.
what we've got is the AstraZeneca vaccine out of Oxford University. It's in its phase 3 trials. The U.S. volunteers, they were inoculated now 5 days ago. They're planning on adding 50 participants a day starting tomorrow. So that's a pretty hardy rollout, and we'll see how that works.
Yeah, it's
Wisconsin,
1,500 a month, and yeah, that's a lot of people.
yeah.
It'll be like I said. It's interesting.
Well, that's a lot of
I
people out
have
of
I have
one
skepticism.
individual laboratory.
Right.
So, I mean, if every laboratory is rolling out 1,500 people, that actually does add up. But nonetheless, I mean, besides picking hairs, that's the AstraZeneca. Moderna's vaccine is already in phase 3 trials, as are Pfizer and BioNTech. So those are basically our three now. The AstraZeneca has apparently just now entered its phase 3. So that puts us at, I guess that actually puts us at 4, since I guess they just put this out as kind of a pre-prep. But anyway, that being said, that's kind of the situation of things. There's more information out there, but I mean, there's a little much to sort through, and that's actually not really what we're talking about today. So,
Nope.
on the note of what we're talking about today, replicatability. Go off,
Ooh,
Kang.
yes. Yeah. So this is a little bit tough for me, right? Because I've built my entire existence is defined by the replication crisis. So I mentioned when you introduced me last week, you had me sit there and talk about where my background is. I apologize. There's an annoying husky to my right. He is chatting because he was away for the weekend. So he is very busy. But in any case, going back to the replication crisis. So I, my background was I started off as a chemical engineer, or more specifically as a biological engineer. That was the major that I had. And when I was doing that, it was to get in-state tuition at an out-of-state school, right? It was I did it. I wasn't really emotionally invested in engineering at the time. My proposed path was to go into medicine, and so I was just kind of going through the motions. Not a good place to be if you're not really motivated to be an engineer. It ends up being kind of painful. So I switched schools, specifically when I met the woman who's now my wife, and decided to change majors. Went into psychology, figured that'd be a nice little cruise major, and ended up absolutely hating it. And that's because you dive into psychology and you start finding out that there is a fundamental difference between the hard sciences and the soft sciences, and engineering and math, right? And I ended up writing it's really surprising. I ended up writing an essay about it, and it got published on an online blog. Here, I'll link that to you. And the stuff that was motivating me in psychology, this was so I graduated in 2008 with my psych degree. And at that time, the replication crisis was kind of known, but not really discussed. And it hit the soft sciences first. It hit the social sciences first, because they have things like Carol Gilligan, which I talked about last week. And I have both a quote from one textbook and another textbook in front of me. that I think I should read in full so that people kind of understand what the social sciences are doing. So I'm going to go with this, which is my Essentials of Psychology by Dennis Kuhn, and it says. Gilligan's point is that male psychologists have, for the most part, defined moral maturity in terms of justice and autonomy. From this perspective, a woman's concern with relationships can look like weakness rather than strength. A woman who's concerned about what pleases or helps others would be placed at stage 3 in Kohlberg's system, but Gilligan believes that caring is also a major element of moral development, and she suggests that males may lag in achieving it, right? So basically there's this dispute between these two psychologists about moral development. The following paragraph, literally right after it is, in italic text, does the evidence support Gilligan's position? And it says, several studies have found little or no difference in men's and women's overall moral reasoning ability, right? So in a psych class, I am being required and tested on a theory or a presentation of that theory that is literally debunked in the subsequent paragraph. And this is something that is common in the social sciences. Gilligan, it is, right? That's you're supposed to be going to school and getting knowledge, and instead this is literal indoctrination. They're saying, well, it doesn't work, right? This doesn't work. We have no evidence of it whatsoever, and I'm sorry that we don't have any evidence of it, but we're going to require you to know this and regurgitate it anyway. So you go into science, like the engineering, right? And you hear about things like Piltdown Man and all of these other hoaxes that we've kept, the science treats it as if it's this looking back thing. We were really stupid. Here's how we learn from our mistakes. And then you go into psychology and it's like, well, they were wrong, but it doesn't matter. It was really important because of feminism. And you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't work. Right. And it's not this like one paragraph in this one textbook. In a separate textbook that I had, it was my adolescent development, Adolescence and Emerging Adulthood was the textbook. It says, although Gilligan's research methods can be criticized for certain flaws, other researchers have begun to explore the issues she has raised using more rigorous methods. In one study, Susan Harder and her colleagues examined Gilligan's idea of losing one's voice in adolescence. However, Harder's research does not support Gilligan's claim that girls' voice declines as they enter adolescence. So we have in two textbooks this woman who has put forth a theory that has been debunked not just in her own research and in the research of other people, but by the people who absolutely adore her. They haven't been able to validate her original claim. And we are still being taught this stuff, right? And these are things that, if you go in and you believe that science is I believed in scientism, right, which is the religion of science. It is the belief that science is good and a moral authority. Anytime you see somebody who wants to say that like science is real or we believe in science or we support science, no. Science is a method, right? You don't believe in science. Science proves that it is correct or it proves that it is incorrect. And here you come from the hard sciences, from your engineering.
Well, let me butt in just for a quick half second and actually say this is going to be your I loves the science ooh-woo, or the
right.
Sciences are great tee-hee kind of
yes.
types. The folks that I loves the science.
Yes, or it's for the science, right? It's its own special cause, right? But it's nothing that actually is scientific. Yeah, right. I think there's actually a comic, and it basically sits there and has somebody say, "Isn't science amazing?" And this guy basically lectures him about science. They basically just like the little tidbits of science. They're not actually interested in the real aspects of it. Let me see if I can pull it up. I think it's Cyanide and Happiness. Yeah, Cyanide and Happiness. Love that.
That's a classic. I'll make sure and link that for everyone.
Yeah, I will. Let me see if I can grab this image here. So I'm going to put this in here. And basically they're turning around and they say in the comic that isn't this a really cool factoid? And somebody says, yeah, I love science. And you go, oh, I'm not really sure you really understand love science. When you love something, you don't just love the exciting and fun parts, you love the boring parts as much as people who truly love science spend their lives studying the tedious little bits as well as the big flashy facts. You don't love science, you're looking at its butt while it walks by, right? And that's the science, the cyanide and happiness thing. And I actually I appreciate it, right? So you go through psychology and you run into this a lot. Gilligan is not the only one, right? So why is Gilligan in this book? The reason Gilligan is this book because she's a feminist and psychology is a left-wing ideology. It is like 96% left-wingers, right?
I can just say right offhand, just look at the reverence given to Freud as opposed to Jung.
Right.
You know, if
right.
I mean, if we're honest, now this, you'll get this one, but this is going to be kind of an out there thing for some of you. But behaviorism works.
Behaviorism.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know the term off the top of my head.
Well, then the too long didn't read is humans can be trained.
Yes.
You can break a person of their problem.
They can, but
it's not necessarily going to be the most pleasant experience. But that being said, behaviorism works. It does.
Yep.
And it's something that psychologists do not like. Because
there's a couple things that psychologists
truth
don't
kind of
like.
Thing. But yeah, do please go off. I just had to make note of that.
No, that's fair, right? So there's a couple things that psychologists really don't like. One is anything that is contrary to the left-wing ideology. And there's actually a paper by Yolenbar and Lammers, which I'm going to link to you right now, which explored this. And in at least psychology, they have reached such a critical mass of folks that if you even bring up something that is not left-wing, or if you express that you don't have a left-wing idea, you won't get hired. Right? You won't get funding, you won't get hired, your paper won't get reviewed. So that stuff just, like, if something comes out that doesn't adhere to left-wing ideology in psychology, it's probably correct because nobody has been able to find a mistake with it. And that's a terrible place for science to be, right? I don't want science to be there. I'm not cheering that on. That is a terrible place. But that's the reality of psychology. And so you if you happen to be, a true lover of science, right? You love statistics, you love the math, you love the theory, you love the experimental design and the challenge that goes along with that. And you go from engineering to psychology. It is a culture shock on a level and plane that I can't even describe, right? So it just shattered me to my core because I walked into this thing thinking this is a science. They spend the first 2 weeks of the course telling you that it's a science, and then they spend the next 13 to 15 weeks of the course absolutely destroying everything that is every single principle, every single funding aspect of science in the name of pushing an ideology, right? And so this ended up just breaking me as a person, right? The key things that psychologists don't like to talk about, they don't like to talk about nature versus nurture, right? Because it turns out that people are predominantly controlled by their genetics. Biological determinism would be kind of what the term is, but it's traits versus behaviors. You can train individual behaviors, but people are always subject to their traits. Folks who are more laymen will understand like IQ or the idea of general intelligence. That is one of the key things that they absolutely despise because it shows when we start talking about traits that not only are they consistent, and they are consistent across populations, and they are consistent with very large numbers, and they replicate extremely well, but it basically creates this idea that people are who they are, and that inequality in society is a byproduct of people being who they are, their genetic code, whatever makes them who they are, and they don't like that. They believe in the thing that we were taught early on is the tabula rasa, and the tabula rasa has been essentially debunked for at least 40 to 60 years. And the tabula rasa is the idea of the blank slate, that every single individual is equal at birth, and that society is really shitty to some people, and it really boosts other people. And the reality is that when we actually go through the papers, it turns out that most of society has almost no impact on you whatsoever. The child rearing, the great thing is that you can't fuck up your kids that bad. The downside is you also can't make them like superstars, right? There's no like there's the reason that people say that there's no like guidebook to parenting is because kids are kind of on autopilot, and this would make sense from an evolutionary perspective, right? You don't want to have parenting be so fundamental that if you fuck it up, your entire gene line is eliminated. Especially when we're dealing with lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my, that in short lifespans, right? This would be a terrible thing if it was that critical. But so psychology, we find out that it's not, and they don't like that. They don't like another thing that comes up is therapy is limited in its effect. They don't really like to talk about that very much. So if you there's different schools of thought of therapy, and they all seem to have like the same efficacy on the outside. And this is something, if you're familiar with like drug and alcohol rehab programs, you can't really sit there and put somebody in a class and give them like a life coach equivalent thing and everything's going to turn out okay, right? You can't reform people, and that idea is kind of ingrained. And it also there's no like healing people of psychological damage. They just kind of go through their life, and there's things. Yes, there's stressors. There's things that can override that, but it requires extreme circumstances, right? The individual who was locked as a child in the attic, we found cases where there's babies who are locked in a child as babies in an attic. They end up developing their own language. You have the stories of these girls who are kidnapped or whatever, or horribly abused. And yes, there's some developmental problems down the line, but they still manage to get, even with all of this is the worst case scenario you can have. They still manage to get out and be relatively functional in society. Yeah, they might not be, engineers and physical scientists, but that's not necessarily. That might be your limitation. You don't hit the highest highs.
Suffice it to say that human beings are an incredibly resilient species.
Yes, yeah, and kids are too. Right? Kids bounce. So you go through psych and you complete this and you go, holy shit, I believed in science and now I don't. And so after 2008, I dove in and I said, hey, so how bad is this, right? Like what do I believe? Like because I was an atheist at that point. And I'm like, well, I don't really believe in God. And I don't really believe in, I'm a libertarian at this point, so I don't really believe in the government. And now science is out, so I have nothing to believe in. The world is meaningless, and nihilism sets in, and it's a terrible thing. So you start reading papers, and more papers, and you find this error is pervasive. Now, obviously, there's certain things that are pretty good. Anything that's dealing with Newtonian physics, pretty good. Relativity, solid. String theory, kind of wonky, but psychology and sociology, it's absolutely rampant. The problem is we found that oncology, or specifically like cancer drugs, seems to be even worse than psychology. And when we start talking about how wrong these people are, it comes out to be something on the order of like 66 to 80% of the studies that they are testing fail replication. Like, think about that for a moment. Psychologists are wrong in 80% of what they're teaching in a textbook. Just pause that there is a field that believes it's a science that's supposed to have a 5% replication failure rate. 1 in 20 studies is supposed to fail, and it's 80%. This is crazy.
I mean, if I'm going to be honest, psychic studies come in at 50% or better at times.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do.
That's really something. Like, if you can't beat a totally random ass psychic study, I mean, it's almost like you're trying to fail.
Well, and that's the thing. So you go back to like Inbar. So why is this happening, right? And you go back to Inbar and Lammers, and part of that is because there's a monoculture, right? They only have one political opinion, So anything that soothes that political the field of science that is absolutely positively the best field to deal with confirmation bias is also the field of science which engages in it at an unprecedented scale. Right? This is the irony of the social sciences. They are the best qualified to detect it, the best qualified to talk about it, and yet they make these mistakes all the time. So, and we'll go through some of these papers here. Actually, I think that we'll probably dive into those sooner rather than later. But yeah, it's like 80%, and you're right. Psychic studies is like 50%. Now, the truth of the matter is that it's not all aspects of psychology, right? So this isn't like I've seen if anybody watches Scott Adams, he's tried to do this with climate change, and this is where like I come in as a climate skeptic. It is on the same thing. I'm seeing the same trends, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But he's like, well, the majority of stuff is wrong, and therefore, even though the majority of this is wrong, the general theory is probably correct. Well, he's assuming that it's a random sampling of stuff that's wrong, and that's not true. What ends up happening is it tends to be the stuff that is overtly political. So, to give you an idea, there was a psych study that came out that said that conservatives are more likely than liberals to be sociopaths or something, or psychopaths, or have a psychological pathology. Well, it turns out that when you actually go through their work, they were wrong. The opposite was true. Now, that's not to ping people. They had to sit there and publish a modification of the paper saying that their original analysis and their conclusion was the opposite of what they said, but really the coding scale worked. But you're like, well, how could that happen, right? Like, that's the one thing you have to do. You code a 1 or a 2, and if it's 1, it's X, and if it's 2, it's Y, and they came up with X when it should have been Y. So that's kind of the level that we're dealing with here. Are you familiar with what is it, stereotype threat and those findings?
No, go ahead.
So stereotype threat is essentially that people perform worse than they should when they are aware of stereotypes, right? So essentially the argument is the problem isn't that men and women diverge in mathematical ability, it's that women are told from a young age that they diverge in mathematical ability. Problem is that that's not really borne out by anything. So stereotype threat is another one of those fields that tends to fail replication every time it's tried. So they'll publish a study with low statistical power, and low statistical power for just as a reference is like really small sample size, or they could even have just a small statistics has practical and statistical significance. A practical significance is a meaningful difference. A statistical significance is a non-meaningful difference, or could be a non-meaningful difference, but you have enough samples to prove that it's real. And so a lot of times they'll have stuff that is a meaningful difference but is not statistically significant, or they'll have a non-meaningful difference that is statistically significant. And that's where you tend to run into these problems as they go in, they start to replicate with a larger sample size, and the effect goes away. One of the examples, the men and women good at math, bad at math kind of thing. There was a paper. I can't remember where it was. I was trying to find it in my Twitter feed because I commented. Somebody pointed it out, and it says that stereotype threat is real, and it's a real problem. And it was something like 200 some odd kids that they sampled, boys and girls, and they said, well, if we teach math in the context of math, then the boys and the girls, the boys do better than the girls, right? So when stereotype threat is present, boys do better than girls. But when we eliminate it, it goes away. Unless, and this is the key, if we make the problem hard. So if basically the premise of the study was that they ran it as a math class. They did a 3D object rotation in a math class. And then they did a 3D object rotation as if it was an art class. And if it was a simple 3D object that they had to rotate and draw or whatever it was, the girls and the boys did relatively well. And they were pretty much equal across the board. Now, if they change it to the implementation of it being a math class, the girls did poorly. and if they change it to a hard problem, the girls do poorly. So it is a funny thing to watch these people argue that stereotypes are a real thing, but it requires the situation. It's only a real thing in the situation where, we're not talking about it being a traditional math class, and the problem isn't hard, right? And the difference in mathematical
let me pause
ability
you for
changes.
a second on that, actually, and let's
Sure.
maybe zoom in on that a little. So, how should I say this? That it sounds like what we're dealing with here is a framing issue. Would I be mistaken in that? Like, is it just the framing of this knowledge that makes it difficult?
No.
Or is it the expectation placed on the person that makes it
No, it's neither nor. So the finding is basically if they try to do something with a high power, large number of people, the effect goes away. And if they do it at low power, they're able to claim an effect, but it only requires and it only appears in certain situations. So they essentially, so the other thing that I want to talk about, this actually comes down to the problem of induction. Are you familiar with the problem of induction?
I'm not. Go ahead.
So the Sherlock Holmes does it best, right? So there are two main ways that we go about knowledge.
I think I might know what you're talking about. Inductive reasoning.
Yes.
Okay,
So,
I kind of do, but please do explain. You'll probably do a lot better job of it than I would.
I don't know about that. So the if I turn around and I take a series of facts and I extrapolate from those facts what likely happened, I can do it in one of two ways. One way is to take all of the facts and then deduce the likely scenario that came from that. And it's kind of like, hey, if I filter all these facts down, this is what I get. The other approach would be induction. And induction says I take some of the facts and I get an answer. And that's what Sherlock Holmes talks about a lot. Is you've come up with a theory that fits some of the facts. I'm trying to come up with a theory that fits all of the facts. And that's the problem that we're predominantly facing, is that this is where confirmation bias runs rampant. If you have a governing philosophy, if you have a governing ideology, and you say that X is true, then when you see some component of X, that's the component that you're going to focus on. So in the study about stereotype threat, when they see that taking a 3D object rotation, a simple basic 3D object rotation, and transferring it from a math class to an art class, the difference disappears. They take that into account and ignore utterly that if in a traditional math class where they're handling this, or a slightly more complicated problem nullifies their result. Right? That's the problem that you're having. And so when you start talking about the general categorization is what's known as group differences on socially valued traits. Essentially, if we have a group of people that be it men or women, or we talk about it as ethnicities or something like that, and there is a divergence between these groups, the argument that psychologists like to make is that that's caused by social situations. The reality is it seems to be trait-based.
So
when we talk about something,
as it were?
What's that?
So an inherent thing.
Yes, it's inherent, right? So sort of, right? Sort of. So when we talk about mathematical ability, or like 3D object rotation and the difference between men and women, there's two problems that you have, and this goes back to the induction versus the deduction, right? So you have a bunch of people who are screaming and crying about the fact that there aren't a lot of female engineers, right? And that's a pretty common thing. We see this discourse, and the conclusion that they have drawn is that the reason that there aren't female engineers is that sexism exists in STEM, right? This is a common discourse, right? But that presumes that men and women are equal in their mathematical ability. The problem is that's not true.
Or even drive, for that matter.
Well, drive. I was going to get to that.
I don't mean to say desires, not drive.
interests is
Yeah.
usually what it comes out to be, right?
Yeah.
So men tend to be interested in things, women are interested in people. But there's also an ability component. And so what you end up having is they'll sit there and they'll say, hey, you take a look at the average between men and women, the average score, the mean, if you will, of the distribution of men and women on mathematical ability is roughly equal. And it's pretty close. Men are a little bit higher than that, but it's not particularly significant. The problem is that your average engineer is not your average, high schooler in math. Your engineer is the dopey kid who is a walking calculator, right? They're the people who talk in weird, like I just opened my my radiation and health physics course book, and I swear to God, there are enough Greek letters in there that the only plausible case is for me to be summoning Satan. There is no practical value to putting that many Greek letters into a scenario, and that's what a lot of people would look at that kind of stuff and do. But the people like who are like me or like Craig, we'll look at that stuff and we'll be like, oh yeah, this is what this means. We can read it as if it's a separate language. And so that's not your average person with their average mathematical ability. That's what's in the tails. That's the top 5% or 2.5% of the population is what becomes an engineer. They're what becomes an economist. They're what becomes a mathematical, a STEM person, right? A traditional STEM person is going to be in that block.
Matter, a head of a corporation. To really run something at that level, you've got to have the drive to do the thing, whatever the thing is, and you have to be willing to learn the knowledge necessary to get the thing done, whatever that thing is. So you can look at this objectively.
And you have to be very, 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 very good at it. They don't hire, like, the guy, Bezos is not your average, small business owner, right?
Certainly
I suspect he's better at running a business than I am at running a business. Just a reasonable assumption, right? And this is the problem that you have, is that you have higher male variability in just about everything that males do, right? Men and women are roughly equal on most traits. There's some things that women do slightly better than men at, and there's some things that men do slightly better on women at the average. But when you get to the tails, it's a very different story. So we come to like language and language abilities, and it's like 3 to 4 women for every men are in the top tier of language characteristics, right? They can read, write, spell, and grammar better than your top tier male. There's 4 women who are better at reading than the best male, kind of thing is roughly how that breaks down. And the same thing's true for math. I think it's like a 2 to 3 to 1 ratio for math, but that's for men. The problem is that leaves you in a situation with what does that mean? Why are we dealing with this? Well, the psychologists, they want to talk about socialization, right? The reason that women aren't doing that particularly well at math is because they were socialized to not do that well at math, and it turns out that's not really true. We can give women hormones. When you start talking about the trans population, we've actually done this. If you give a woman testosterone, her 3D rotational ability improves. So that kind of indicates that there's a gender difference there. It's our hormones that are flowing through us that allow us to do certain things better than we could otherwise.
Are you saying that would be an inconvenient truth? It
would be an inconvenient truth, yeah.
Huh.
So that's the other thing that you end up seeing with this, and I'm only focusing on the men-women thing because it's less politically charged than diving into some of the other group differences on social value traits like IQ. That tends to people call that racist science.
Yeah,
when it's
we'll
just
stay away from the bell curve for now. Then, okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. We'll stay away from that.
We'll save that for another episode.
See
if we can get
I'll
Dr.
probably
to discuss that with you.
Doctor Who?
No, nobody.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, it's I mean, it's easier to talk about the difference between men and women than it is to talk about ethnic differences, predominantly because men and women, as a general rule, understand that men and women are different. It's only in psychology are they arguing that we're exactly the same, even Steven, and it's only because of those evil sexists that women aren't the same, aren't engineers. And the reality is that another thing that we see, there was another study that had like 10,000. So this is replicated numerous times. We've been able to do it. We've been able to replace alter body chemistry, and we can produce the effect. We can demonstrate the effect in the tails. We can demonstrate the effect in interest, right? Peterson talks about the Norwegian countries and egalitarianism, and how when we minimize sex differences overall in society, we maximize sex differences in overall personality traits. And so we're constantly finding this to be true. And yet psychology doesn't want to deal with that. And this is the problem that you have when you're a psych student, is you basically, you go into these classes and you read this thing and they say, oh, but let's look at all of these possibilities for it not to be. But then when I turn around and I read about Carol Gilligan and her theory that has never held up, not at all in any way, shape, or form, well, that it's still valuable and you still have to be tested on it, right? So, we don't talk about ethnicity and IQ. No. That would be bad to talk about ethnicity and IQ. But you're not going to get tested on that, right? We actually had the dean of our psych program show up to the class that they were going to talk about that in, right? But we didn't get the same preferential treatment when you have random bullshit that nobody can actually prove, right? That's not something where we need the dean to talk about and mitigate those issues. We need it to come in on the stuff that's highly replicable. And this is the issue that psychology has. It consistently has this problem where it's a science issue that kind of defines it. So I spent a lot of time digging into some of the other stuff there, and you start reading more and more papers.
Well, I'm struck with a thought as you're describing this. It sounds like psychology has been gentrified by hipsters.
I don't know if that's true, as much as I think that you are dealing with a bunch of people who are interested in the human condition, right? And what causes us to be who we are. And there's actually a really great discussion on the social acid, is basically the concept. So you start talking about why is it that these people were absolutely opposed to the theory of evolution back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Why was that such a thing? And it basically erodes at the core this idea that there is a difference between humans and animals, right? Evolution essentially says we're just slightly more advanced animals, right? We're not a product of God. We're not a product of we're not this unique thing that stands above all in the hierarchy. And I think when you start talking about these group differences on socially valued traits, psychology ends up running into the same thing. And basically it says that we aren't equal, and we have to deal with that. And they don't like that because it then, now we're talking about evolution of the mind. And that tackles the same thing, that we're trying to sit there and deal with the fact that we're all equal, and in a metaphysical sense, we are, right? Everybody has the great thing about Western civilization is that we all are all equal. We should all respect each other. We should all treat each other with honor, right? But in a real practical sense, we're not, and we never will be. And that's the issue that psychologists have. Is on one hand, that's what they want. They're kind of it's. Are you familiar with the term proto-science?
I'm not.
So a proto-science is it's almost so you go through sciences like chemistry and physics and all the other stuff. They actually evolved out of non-sciences, stuff that we would never even like. Chemistry evolved out of alchemy. Physics evolved out of naturalism. That's what it's called. I'm not quite sure about that. So essentially we have this thing that kind of produces these results, but it's all driven by ideology. So the idea of alchemy was the premise of turning you know lead into gold, or to extend human life indefinitely. These kinds of nonsensical drives with what they were playing around with, right? We know now that that is absolutely in no way possible, but that was still what people were aiming to do. And the same thing happens with psychology. Psychology wants to get us to a point where we have the most positively constructed society that we can. And for some people, that means, minimizing inequality, maximizing the ability of an individual to operate within our society. Everybody is doing, like, we're all equals is really what they feel. And if we start turning around and saying, yeah, you're not equal, your brain is not equal to my brain, right? That we're not equal, we're different. And that becomes a very difficult concept, I think, for a lot of folks in psychology. And so what you end up having is this throws us into what's it called? Cognitive dissonance.
And how
And
long would
this
you say this
throws
has been an issue then? I mean, can you nail it down to a time?
so if you actually go back, it goes back decades to the 60s and 70s.
I mean, is this a thing of
So
modern psychology? Is there a time when this wasn't an issue?
the earlier days of psychology. So you start talking about the era of Freud. So I think it was the early 1900s. They turned around and they said, okay, well, we look at what chemistry has done, and we look at what physics has done, and we look at what biology has done, and they have just done a great job, right? They have earned a ton of respect because, this is a time where we're electrifying the world, where we're demonstrating all of these really cool effects. We think we can do the same thing with psychology, but we're going to have to dump Freud. We're going to have to dump a lot of these people that have been kicking around in the background. And it was, for the first few decades, its goal was to be as scientifically accurate as possible. And then in the 60s and 70s, they had the 60s and 70s. And from there, you started. There's a couple things that ended up happening. One, ethics committees came in, and there's some legitimacy to this. So I'm not saying ethics committees are bad, but they started severely restricting what you could do as part of a psychological experiment. So it no longer became acceptable to try to tease out the reality of the human mind. And instead, they had to kind of try to beat around the bush. So it made it a lot harder to get you can't do things like the Millikan experiment, right? Which I think it's the Millikan experiment. I'd have to double check it. But you can't do things where you put a guy in there and you're pretending to shock somebody else, even though you're not actually harming anybody, because it caused real psychological distress. When people got to the point where they're putting in voltages that they could be killing somebody at, that actually caused a lot of distress for people, which, that's a good thing, right? They're human beings, right?
Right.
The
Yeah. No,
majority of
that
people
should bother you.
aren't right. That should bother you, but they still did it. And the end
And that should
result was
bother
that
you
we
too.
found. That should bother you too. But it only about 25% of people will resist authority and operate, in whatever context they believe is correct. That's an unfortunate reality of psychology, is that only 25% will. But yeah, it should bother you. It's a real thing to bother you, but they decided that was unethical to do. And so you run into this problem of, well, what about informed consent? So you were talking a little bit about your, them going after informed consent with a virus study. Well, that's a little bit easier to do. But if I'm trying to tease out the realities of the human mind, and I need to get informed consent, well,
Yeah, that is a bit
that's
of a
going to
sticky
change
issue
the
because
experiment.
you're kind of. I mean, if depending on where you're going with things, you can really be tearing a person apart to get an answer,
Well,
in an
you could
almost
be
literal sense.
there's two parts to that, right? So you could be tearing somebody apart, and by telling them and getting informed consent, you're automatically changing the result, right? So it's almost down in your quantum physics level of, if you look at it, it changes.
Well,
problem that you have with
or
that.
to put it in, psychological terms, the subject is perhaps even a little hypnotized.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing, right? So we know that they're gonna react different. So that kind of 60s and 70s, you got things like I think it was the Milligan experiment or the Millikan experiment, and then you got the Zimbardo experiment. Which, are you familiar with that?
Uh,
That's been overturned, by the way. So they didn't even get credible results, but they they have they did this, and it basically screwed a whole bunch of people up.
I want to
And
say I am, but I'm not 100% sure. And if it is what I'm thinking it is, you should absolutely tell people.
so the Zimbardo experiment was also known as the Stanford Prison experiment.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Go through this. Definitely.
Yeah, so they basically they turned around and they hired a whole bunch of college kids to one group of them was going to play guards and one group of them was going to play prisoners, and the idea was to investigate the prison system and what happens and all the injustices that occur there. The idea would be that we would have they were just going to make one group identifiably different and in charge and the other group non-identifiable, and that was his theory. They went through and they said, "Oh, we had to end it in like 3 or 4 days," and things got terrible and all of these things. So they were trying to push for prison reform using this experiment. Turns out none of that's entirely true. They may have encouraged the guards to be a little bit more violent than they should have been. They encouraged the prisoners to kind of play along. There was, some of the results were hyped and exaggerated, and this actually happens a lot in psychology. So the end of asylums came about from a dude who turns out falsely replicated his experiment. He basically tried to commit himself, and it was showing that sane people. His goal was to show that sane people would be punished by the asylum, and it was a terrible place, and that's just not necessarily the case. And it years later that got overturned, and you get stuff like the money experiment. Are you familiar with the money experiment?
I'm not. I might be, but I don't think I am.
So this is the oddly enough the so this is they decided at one time that they were going to try to prove that gender is a social trait. So all of these folks out there who are arguing this is largely based off of the money study. And the money study sat there and had a kid who, he was. I think they were going for a circumcision, and they utterly botched it. So
I do know
the psychologist.
Oh, this is a dark story.
It is a dark story. It's a really, really dark story, right? So the psychologist turned around and he was convinced that gender was a social trait, that we could train people to be more men or more women. And so he took this kid, he convinced the parents to basically raise him as a girl. They were going to they had it like surgically modified, so he basically got a vaginoplasty. And then he reported his results as this kid went along, going through therapy to train him and condition him to be a girl. Turns out none of what he actually said was true. There may have been some pedophilia involved because he was basically having, the kid and his brother. His brother would dry hump him to teach him the appropriate sexual position as like a 12 or 14-year-old kid. Really dark stuff. They had to like take his clothes off and stare at it in the mirror and talk about him being a girl. Really kind of creepy and dark stuff. Eventually, oddly enough, this actually validates the trans proposal, because the end result was when the kid finally found out when he was in his 20s that he was really a boy with a botched penis. He basically converted his full identity to being male, and it just got rid of all the other stuff. It didn't, he said that it wasn't right. It didn't feel right for him the whole time. And I think he ended up killing himself at a later date because of this guy. But he published, Money published all this stuff as if his theory was absolutely true and that gender is a social construct. And it turns out gender is not a social construct. Another thing that psychologists don't like to talk about. And so all of these kinds of studies happened, and they just pushed psychology further and further to away from being an actual valid science, because they would allow, by putting in these ethics requirements, they were no longer really able to test the theory So they could always, and because they can't test the theory, nobody else can test the theory, right? Like it's kind of a mutually assured destruction thing. And then on the other hand, they also are they're diving in and they're able to get more. They're able to let their confirmation bias kind of flood the things through, and then that ends up reinforcing itself. So you basically get this publishing bias, and it's this ever increasing feedback loop until such time as you get me going through in 2008, where I'm reading in one paragraph that somebody has this great theory, and in the next paragraph that they've never actually validated it, but you have to learn it anyways, and you're getting quizzed on it, right? So there was a time where it appears that they had some really good results that were replicable, but as things are going on, it's not. And so when we start talking about the things that are not, they tend to be political. Like I was talking about the stereotype threat stuff, that doesn't appear to be replicable. The stuff that's underpinning the Black Lives Matter protests, that doesn't appear to be replicable. That's the implicit bias training and critical race theory. That stuff doesn't appear to be replicable anytime they've tried it. It just falls apart on its face.
As a matter of fact, a lot of those are. I mean, if we're going to be honest, a lot of this critical race stuff, it's not just garbage. It's actually legitimately racist.
Oh yeah. Yeah,
I mean, I don't even have to deconstruct these things all that far. It's merely just kind of slipping the mask back a little.
Well, the issue that they have is it's not just that it's like a little bit racist. It's that they are contorting themselves into a pretzel, right? They have a belief, and that belief must be true, and the problem is that reality doesn't conform to that belief. So in order to get there, they have to invent all of these. You go back to the
well, they have to decolonialize science, right?
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. They have to insert epicycles and all this other complex stuff to try to make it true, because every single time they try to go in and prove their theory was really correct, it turns out that it's not. That's the issue that they're having right now. But you can dive into these things, and you can actually so when you start talking about modern science, this is the issue that they have, is that they're basically turning around, they're going it through. Oh, I forgot to link this. Shame on me. They're going through things like the problem of induction, and they're only using some of what they see to create their theory. They're not really using deductive reasoning. They're not really testing the theory. They're not putting it to these things, and this is kind of rampant in psychology. And I know I've focused entirely on psychology. There are other fields, and we will get to them, I promise. And the odd part is that we actually know how to identify this stuff, and we just don't. So there's things like the Mertonian norms, which are an interesting concept, and these are basically saying, if science is to be science, what is it that we need to expect of that science? And it's got to be things like you need to promote the openness of the intellectual property, that the scientific validity needs to be independent of whatever feature of the participants. The scientists are supposed to be disinterested, and they're supposed to be skeptical. And what we end up having is that it's not it's kind of the opposite of that. So we have this. It turns out that a lot of scientists don't want to share their data, and that's been an issue that's been coming up. A lot of journals are actually starting to correct that. They're starting to mandate that the data be presented, but they used to basically kind of hold it to the vest, and that what's ended up happening is that a lot of people have called it into question. So you look at like the hydroxychloroquine thing, right? They kind of held the data to the vest, and they were making claims based on this data set. And then when people said, "Hey, I want you to show me that data set because it doesn't make sense," well, it turns out the data set didn't exist, right? Right. Whoops. There might have been some small issues with their representation of it. You can talk about things like universalism, or and this is where you and I and Craig would disagree. I actually extend this to generalization, where they'll take very specific case studies and apply them as if they're universal principles. One of the key problems here is when we start talking about, like, again, psychology, which I got to get off psychology. I really do. They have a tendency to use 18 to 24-year-old college students because they're there. So they
yeah,
have
that is
this
going
sample.
to make for a really, really bad sample set.
Right,
Especially
exactly.
if you consider what's become of modern academia. I mean, it is kind of one-sided, and even when it isn't one-sided, it kind of leads a person to... if you don't fit the norm, you're not going to really go out of your way to make that clear these days. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Right. Well, and that's part of the issue they have. The other issue that they have is now, by using something like college kids, they get this this politically and ideologically different group than not only what is in the rest of the country, but they'll then try to apply this as a universal principle or component. I think there was a study, I can't remember which one it was, where they were talking about, like, human sexuality. And the entire basis of the study was Italian women. Well, it turns out that Italian women have different sexual habits than the rest of the world, right? They're different. And that's not, I can't remember what the specific trait was that they were measuring, but they were saying this is the case, but when in reality it's just Italian women. They'll do the same thing with college kids and their values. So they'll sit there and they'll do a survey saying, hey, most people are progressive. Well, it turns out that most college students are progressive, not necessarily the rest of the country. And that's another issue that they're having, is that they're generalizing these results. And I'm only going to touch on this for a moment. The mask thing is where I come in on that, just to get away from psychology, just because I've been bashing psychology, and I don't want to bash psychology forever because I think there's some value left there. I just think that they're not going the right direction. But when we start talking about the mask studies, what you end up seeing is a whole bunch of stuff says it doesn't do anything, and then a whole bunch of stuff that says it does do something, and everybody sits there and harps on the stuff that it does something, but those are cases where it's source control. An individual who's actively coughing and sneezing, or it's sitting there and talking about the effects that happen within a foot to 2 feet, within about a foot of an individual's face. And I hate to tell you, like, if I'm within a foot of another's face, somebody else's face, there's some fucking that's going to happen, right? I'm either going to be fucking them up, or we're going to actually be fucking, because there is no reason to be within a foot of somebody else's face. So carrying your entire experimental analysis to the effect of masks within a foot of your face doesn't even make any sense. Right, and then saying that this is true for normal social communication, which is happening at a 4-foot distance, doesn't really become practical, because I could make the same argument saying, if I was infinite feet away, does it still hold true? Well, according to those studies and that logic, it would. So we need to kind of define these things. Talk about this.
That just today, I think some team owner was ejected from stadium for standing on the top row by himself without a mask. So, it is important that we, consider the safety of others. I think he was in the company box too, but what do I know?
All of that still depends on a whole bunch of other factors being present, and to say that we should start sitting there and restricting this behavior or that behavior based on some sort of thing that has nothing to do with a scenario that it's being applied to is where I draw an issue, right? So if I'm not seeing anything for the specific scenario, I generally will dismiss the study. Disinterestedness is, we'll dive into that one. I think that's actually, so organized skepticism. I think we can agree that a lot of folks aren't particularly skeptical, but let's talk about disinterestedness. And I have a study that I love for this.
Okay.
It's my favorite study.
I have a feeling I know where you're going with this, but I'm really curious to see if I'm right or not.
Oh, go ahead. You tell me what you think, because I'm sure it's not.
I only just have some vague ideas in my head, basically, just kind of where this is headed. About, disinterestedness. You should say that's what, literal.
So disinterest is this would be like your premise of objectivity, right? You should not have a thumb on the scale. You should, right.
Okay.
Exactly. Right. So that's what it is. So you start talking about disinterest. This is difficult to say many times fast. Disinterestedness. It's a
I
very
know this
large
girl
word.
Sally. She sells seashells.
Yeah,
You should check some of them
yeah,
out. She's
yeah.
great deals, great deals down by the
Maybe,
seashore.
maybe like a couple beers ago. That might be a better time to do that. But so I'm actually going to throw this study in here, and we'll talk a little bit about disinterested. Just y'all know what I'm talking about. We're just going to go with that.
The topic of the
Toss
moment:
that topic of the
disinterestedness.
moment. Yes. So the issue that you have when we start talking about psychology, and I see it in climate change, I see it in a couple other fields, but those are the big ones politically right now. Is that the scientists have their thumb on the scale. They have made a value judgment ahead of time. And so we're going to actually, so I got to this because I was arguing with a
Oh yeah,
feminist.
that's bad science. I mean, that's just bad science out the gate. I mean, I can say that it's just some
Are you
nobody.
talking about the link that I just tossed in?
No,
Or
no, I'm saying that sort of practice.
yeah, it is. So let me let's dive into this paper here, because we're gonna deconstruct kind of how this goes. So there, just as background, there was a paper a few years ago. I think this is published in when was this? 2015, the one that I'm reading from, and this is based off of a previous paper known as Moss-Recusant et al. And Moss-Recusant et al., which we will dive into, essentially found that there was preferential treatment in STEM fields for men over women, and that was their argument. They had a couple different traits. We'll go in and deconstruct that one, because it's directly connected to the one that I just linked.
All right.
And this just set off like this firestorm. STEM is sexist. Everybody, women are discriminated against. This is proof. And
So what is this where the whole get more women in STEM drive came from? Is that what you're saying?
I don't know if it came from that. Like, that's always been kind of going on, but it was it's not that women aren't interested. So this was arguing the nature versus nurture thing. So previously it was, hey, the reason that we don't have women in STEM is because they're not interested, and B, you start running into math problems early on. And this came out and said, nope, it's really sexism. And that's essentially what people are using the Moss-Recusant et al. Not this paper that I just linked. I'll link Moss-Recusant et al. in a bit. So we're gonna read this together. And so this is the abstract that I'm going to read, and you can think on it. Right, and I'll talk about. I was going to do a whole PowerPoint presentation, but like I said, I realized that nobody actually was interested in this on my YouTube channel. I actually have like a viral video on my YouTube channel on identifying plaster versus drywall, and all of this science stuff, nothing. It's like 80 views. But plaster versus drywall, tens of thousands of people want to hear my opinion on plaster versus drywall.
Hey, which hard hitting issues.
It is hard-hitting issues. It makes me laugh every time I sit there and pull that up, because it keeps on going up. Somehow, this one video that is the stupidest thing ever. I was just taking down a wall and talking about how to identify it, and it was like, it's for asbestos concerns and some of the other stuff that you have to deal with plaster, right? But I hate plaster. I just do. It's dusty. It's degraded. I love the fact that nice modern materials are flat on their surface and not like super shitty. And apparently, like, everybody loves my commentary on plaster versus drywall. So this is one of the things that I was actually working on. I've got my little PowerPoint up that I was going to do on it. But let's start by reading this abstract. So the I got to this article by a feminist trying to use this to prove that there is bias in STEM without linking Moss-Recusant et al. And this came from, like, I think Think Progress was the website I got directed to from this. And at least, I give them credit. I do give Think Progress credit, because they did actually have a link to the proper journal article. And anybody who links you like a journal article, or not not a journal article, but an actual like news piece or blog piece or whatever, 9 times out of 10 they don't have an active link to the paper that they are discussing, which makes it, oh my god, this is kind of creepy. I'm gonna have to send this to my wife.
Okay.
Turns out that they're like that this is taking place right up the road from me, is where this paper came out of. that's
Oh
kind of
wow.
creepy. Weird. Yeah, right. So like I read it in this Department of Psychology, and I'm like, oh, oh. So here's how this abstract reads. Scientists are trained to evaluate and interpret evidence without bias or subjectivity. Thus, growing evidence revealing a gender bias against women or favoring men within science, technology, engineering, and mathematics (STEM) settings is provocative and raises questions about the extent to which gender bias may contribute to women's underrepresentation within STEM fields. To the extent that research illustrating gender bias in STEM is viewed as convincing, the culture of science can begin to address the bias. However, are men and women equally receptive to this type of experimental evidence? This question was tested with 3 randomized double-blind experiments, 2 involving samples from the general public, number is equal to 205 and 303 respectively, and 1 involving a sample of university STEM and non-STEM faculty. The total number is 205 for the second one, right? So they're testing about the effect of gender biases in STEM, and they have a larger sample size for non-STEM people. Just throwing that out there. In all experiments, participants read an actual journal abstract reporting on gender bias in a STEM context, or an altered abstract reporting on no gender bias in for one of their experiments, and evaluated the overall quality of the research. Results across experiments show that men evaluate the gender bias research less favorably than women, and of concern, this gender difference was especially prominent among STEM faculty. These results suggest a relative reluctance amongst men, especially faculty men within STEM, to accept evidence of gender biases in STEM. This finding is problematic because broadening the participation of underrepresented people in STEM, including women, necessarily requires a widespread willingness, particularly by those in the majority, to acknowledge that bias exists before transformation is possible.
Okay, let
What do
me
you
have
believe
you
are the issues?
pause actually immediately there, and throw out. I've been on Twitter for too damn long, so let me throw out some anecdotes that I've kind of run into in that time. That in following some of the few women in tech that we've seen kind of come and go, a lot of what we hear is that they actually don't have it quite as hard.
That's true.
They, I don't want to say that they're carried by their compatriots, but that they are, they have a bit of an easier go of it.
Well, so there's 2 parts to that, right? So all the way through the STEM process, because there's this emphasis to try to get women into STEM, from the time that the universities accept them to the time that they graduate, they get some preferential treatment that men don't get. And there may actually be some legitimate truth to Moss, Rakusin et al. In that regard, which we'll talk about that in a little bit. But yes, women do technically have it easier, and at least on the path. And there is a significant amount of research that supports that idea. But I wanted to ask you, like I said, I linked it. What do you have? Do you see anything in that abstract that you would take issue with seeing in a scientific paper?
Well, as you say, the sample size is not really good, and it looks like they're what do I want to say here? They're maybe they need a broader cross section as well for their samples. Like, it looks like these look to my eye very. It looks like they've got very specific demographics, you might say. Not to say that that's going to be all they have, but with these kind of numbers and in one place, you're going to be looking at a really... It's a very small amount of data for a very big question.
That is all a very... So that's the... I agree.
That's my immediate takeaway.
That is an easy takeaway, but what I was actually aiming for in the question was the language used. Is there anything you take issue with? And so going back to that disinterestedness topic, right? Here's what I found, right? We have a line that says, in all experiments, participants, some of which, based on the numbers we have, most of which are not, they're samples from the general public, they're not STEM faculty, Even when we start talking about the
more
university,
than doubling their basics, more than doubling their actual STEM people
right,
numbers.
right. Participants read an actual journal abstract and evaluated the overall quality of the research. I don't think that participants have the ability to read an abstract and evaluate the overall quality of the research. I just don't. I think that's a problem.
That's a very valid concern. Yeah,
right.
That did not jump out at me at all. Yeah, actually, no,
Right.
That's real. I mean, that's kind of why this show exists, so that I can maybe make a little bit more of this stuff accessible to a person. So yeah, that didn't jump out at me at all. No.
Well, that's the thing.
That's incredibly valid, because
right?
your average person isn't necessarily going to have the framework to put any of this into terms that make sense to them.
Well, and that's the thing, is this stuff. This is like, if you don't start breaking it down, you might miss some of this stuff. But that is an issue, right? How can you read a journal abstract and evaluate the overall quality of the research? I don't know how that can be done. Right? Some journal abstracts don't include any other sample size.
Oh, I mean, an abstract in and of itself it's your a brief once over, basically. I mean, it's not even a Cliff's Notes. It's like, here's what we're going for, here's kind of what we're expecting, and here's kind of the results, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's kind of what it's supposed to be.
I mean, I'm broadly shorthanding it, but then an abstract is basically broadly shorthanding it.
It's your summary of your paper, right? It's all of the stuff that you looked at and all the other stuff. You try to fit it into like a paragraph.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't minutia there.
Right.
I mean, necessarily there's not.
Right, exactly. So evaluating the overall quality of the research becomes difficult. Now, that's not to say that you can't make an evaluation, right? If you can read certain things and be like, yeah, this is fucking bullshit.
Yeah, but I mean, as you say, we're looking at a larger cross section of laymen that they don't have that framework of knowledge to really make heads and tails of the meat and potatoes of the study.
So you turn around as an individual who's looking for a little bit more exposure in this stuff, and you're saying, "Hey, I'm seeing these sample things." So you have something sticking out, you saying, "Hey, this is probably not good." So there's some value in that. But how do you evaluate the overall quality of the research solely from an abstract? I wouldn't say that's possible, right? So the second line that I pulled out that was interesting to me was, it says, scientists are trained to evaluate and interpret evidence without bias or subjectivity. Thus, growing evidence revealing a gender bias against women or favoring men is provocative. That doesn't really make sense as a statement, right? Because we are trained to evaluate and interpret evidence without bias or subjectivity. So why would growing evidence revealing a gender bias be provocative unless there's not growing evidence? And what constitutes evidence, right? Is it abstracts based like what they talked about earlier? Is it just an abstract? Is that what's supposed to be a body of evidence? Because I wouldn't consider that to be a body of evidence, right? A third line is, these results suggest a relative reluctance among men, especially faculty men within STEM, to accept evidence of gender biases in STEM. So the accept evidence part of this statement is another one that really bothers me, because we're not supposed to just accept evidence. That's not what we're supposed to do.
If I'm gathering this correctly, the way you've set this up is basically the same as the intro to that psychology book. Am I right? So, I mean, this abstract in and of itself, if I'm understanding how you're breaking this down to me, the abstract in itself kind of nullifies itself.
Well, it doesn't per se nullify itself.
Perhaps, to a degree.
It identifies itself as being a facet of scientism rather than of science, right? I'm seeing things in here that are looking like the paper is...
So it's to say that it's more divorced from real scientific thought then.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That would be accurate. So it's demanding that you accept evidence. It's sitting there and saying that, that it's limiting that evidence to abstracts.
As opposed to teaching.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And then you get things like this finding is problematic because broadening the participation of underrepresented people in STEM, including women, necessarily requires a widespread willingness, particularly by the majority, to acknowledge that bias before transformation is possible. So that's just a whopper of a statement, right? Because you've
Okay.
when you say
Well, yeah,
something is
actually break that
problematic,
down because there's a lot of English in that sentence. So,
there is.
yeah, break that down because I get it. I'd like other people to get it.
So it says this finding is problematic because broadening the participation of underrepresented people in STEM, and I'll actually cut out some of the junk, requires a widespread willingness to acknowledge that bias exists before transformation is possible. So what they're
That's a
saying,
heavy statement right there.
that is,
Let's get into that.
So it is determined that what they found in their paper, that the fact that people are skeptical, right, which is another Mertonian norm, you're supposed to be skeptical of findings, because men are more skeptical than women when they are solely shown an abstract, is a problem because it doesn't allow us to transform STEM. That's kind of fucked up, right? That is a value judgment and a half. You're turning around and saying, you're by saying that something is problematic rather than demonstrating an actual problem, because all this paper is doing is dealing with people reading an abstract and determining that people need to have a widespread willingness and that you have to acknowledge that the bias exists and that you want to transform a field. That's a hefty sentence. That is a hefty claim that is not supported by this paper. This is literally stating, right? Yes, it does. So they're basically turning around and saying that it doesn't matter whether this is true. What matters is what we can do with it, and that's a bad sentence to write in a scientific paper, right? But it's there, and this is published in PNAS, right? The I don't know, procession of the National Academy of Sciences. I love that it's called PNAS, by the way. It's just I know I'm like 14. It's fantastic.
Well, it does seem like they're a bunch of dicks from what I can read here, at least.
So what this really boils down to, when you go through this whole entire thing, is, and I rewrote it in one sentence. All of that English from that phrase and the four of the sentences before it is: in all experiments, participants read a provocative abstract. It is problematic that men evaluate provocative abstracts less favorably than women. That seems to be what their issue is. Now, that's not in the actual thing. That is my interpretation and my read of this, that is what their issue is that when they sent a bunch of abstracts out to people, they found it problematic that men didn't simply accept it on face value, whereas women did. Now, I actually have an issue with the fact that the women accepted an abstract on face value. That's more of an issue to me, but hey, whatever, right? I'm a skeptic, so what do you do? So, bad paper. Bad ideas, bad paper all the way through. And this is one of those things that's a replication crisis. But what's interesting, let me see if I can find it. It's buried in here, so this is going to take me a moment to look through.
Sure.
So the abstract is bad. The abstract is unscientific. The abstract is added value judgments. And I think my favorite part of this whole entire paper is they literally. So the whole premise is that it's an issue that people are not sitting there and reacting positively to the abstract, or there's a difference in how people react to this. But we come down here to page 4 of 6, where page 5 and 6 are the references, and limitations and future discussions. And the paragraph before the conclusion starts like this: further research might also explore why our first 2 experiments did not replicate previous research, demonstrating an overall bias favoring the research of men above women in STEM. So we have them citing abstracts that essentially are disproved with and I'll be honest, it's a larger sample size than the original abstracts they were presenting, and then they're upset
actually,
that it didn't replicate.
Give me that one more time, because I was paying attention and I don't know if I necessarily got it. So
here,
drop that on us one more time here.
So hold on, let me see if I can. Boo. Give me. I will send you a snip of the paragraph in the abstract because it's easier to see it when it's in the wall of text and everything else.
Oh, sure.
Hold on. Give me just a moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Minimize that. We're gonna hit this, and we're gonna go.
Of course, this is the penis.
This is
It
this is
is
the
funny when you
actual
say it
paper.
out. It's funny when you say it out loud.
It is, isn't
It
it?
is,
I know,
it is.
I know. It's shame on
That's
me and
incredibly
all that.
juvenile, but I mean, juvenile humor is funny. So you know,
So
what do you say?
along with juvenile humor is funny, right? So somebody on my YouTube thing, again with my plaster is worse than wallboard. They actually commented that my language was terrible. I'm like, oh well, too bad. This is how real engineers speak. I speak fucking fluently. All right, so I have linked it in the chat. The whole little section here, and it says further research might also explore where our first two experiments did not replicate previous research, demonstrating an overall bias favoring the research of men above women in STEM. However, we did not find that participants in experiment 1 and 2 favored the abstract written by Mosterkusen et al. More if they thought it was written by a man versus a woman. So, they in the abstract have put in this value judgment about how it's problematic that men in STEM don't accept blah, 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 blah. And then they tried to replicate the previous research and failed to do so. So they have decided that it's bad that people are not accepting these abstracts on face value. Meanwhile, they aren't able to actually validate in their own research that those abstracts are actually valid. Like, that's just, it's a whopping doozy of specialness.
That really, I'm trying to wrap my head around this, and if I'm to understand correctly, not all. Well, I don't know if I want to say not all. Well, correct me if I'm wrong. Not only have they basically invalidated their own premise, they've reinforced an opposing premise.
That would be a correct interpretation. They had research that said this is evidence of gender bias in STEM. They then turned around and did their own research that said it's really bad that not everybody automatically accepts this evidence of gender bias in STEM. But as part of it, they also were unable to replicate the previous findings showing that it was a problem in the first place. So essentially...
So to surmise, if, again, correct me if I'm wrong, what's happened here, they went to reinforce this previous study, and in so doing, not only completely avoided their own hoped-for outcome, but invalidated it. And then, in invalidating it, buried it in a wall of text in small print at the end.
Yes, that is exactly what happened there.
Classic.
It is not listed in their methods, or you have no idea that is coming unless you read through the entire paper and got to the end.
Oh,
but it is a problem.
Astounding. I mean that's actually emblematic of modern journalism as well.
This is a consistent problem that is being expressed across multiple facets of our society.
This is kind of a critical theory issue. I mean,
I don't know if it's a critical theory issue.
No. I don't mean an issue of critical theory. I mean the issue of critical theory being kind of widely accepted and pushed.
Yes, yeah, that would be fair. So basically, they had an unsupported hypothesis. They then sat there and started going shamey on you poor men of STEM for not supporting our hypothesis. Meanwhile, they discovered when they tried to test it on their own terms that the hypothesis didn't hold up to scrutiny. That's what happened. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. And people were linking this to me, and I just ripped it apart. So, I think that's in the thing, and it's in there, and we will dive into Mosterkusen et al. This is the core paper that pushed this, right? And so we're going to talk.
This is what they were trying to validate, then.
Right.
Okay. All right.
So I have linked the second paper in the chat, and it's Science's Faculty's Subtle Gender Biases Favor Male Students. And basically the N is equal to 127, which they broke into two categories, a male and a female. So they did 63 tests with one and 64 tests with another. And you read this whole entire thing, and it basically says science faculty from research-intensive universities rate the application materials of a student who is randomly assigned either male or female name from a laboratory manager position. Faculty participants rated the male participants significantly more competent and hireable than the identical female applicant.
Okay, I actually heard about this study.
Yep, this was a big one. Right?
Oh, okay. So, all right, yeah. I do know what you're talking about. I imagine that at least a couple of people listening will at least be passingly familiar, because, I mean, this was one of the big things that kind of pushed that women in STEM narrative in, I want to say, 14, 15, 16 really hard, when we got, when the dude in the shirt with all the ladies on it caught all the shit because he was wearing a shirt with ladies on it. And landed something the size of a Volkswagen Bug on a comet moving through space at a patently ridiculous speed.
Yep. Yeah, this is that. So you read this thing, and this is the abstract. This is the only, like, I'd go through the whole entire thing. I mean, if somebody wants to read it, the paper's there. I highly recommend it. It's not. There's nothing linked. Particularly. There's nothing. The N equals 127. Like, if I see an N that isn't in the thousands, it raises a red flag for me. Because there's, especially if they break it into two separate things. So your N is really 63 and 64 from one versus the other.
And this
it doesn't
even. I can only. Well, here, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm going to assume that this doesn't even really take into account the changing face of STEM and kind of this push. I imagine this kind of goes at that as though it isn't even a thing, right?
It doesn't really.
That's
irrelevant to the study.
Yeah, whereas it actually, in its way, it's quite relevant to the study. So I would imagine the study itself just doesn't even really consider that, right?
It doesn't evaluate that at all. They chose a bunch of different metrics. And I actually I ended up pulling the statistics out and running them myself, and it turns out that what they were reporting is bullshit. If you actually break it down into standard statistical tests,
the numbers aren't even good. Oh, great.
No, the numbers aren't good.
Oh.
So, and I want this to be very clear, because here, let me see if I can actually I'll look into this as I talk about it. But I wrote all this stuff out in a giant Excel spreadsheet, and I pulled the actual numbers, and I did all of this work to sit there and test to see whether any of this was like significant at the 1.96, which is a 5% probability of being wrong. Again, they're sitting there and they're talking about it being significant at, like, P is a 0.001 or P of 0.002. First off, psychologists are not statisticians. They don't know how to statisticalize stuff. I'm not saying that I'm a statistician, but I know that they're wrong. Right, but this is their abstract is not particularly, like, it's not massively disconcerting. It's not really crazy, but that's what they did. Now you turn around and you say, okay, why is it that there is a difference between men and women from the previous study, right? And that's likely because one thing is anti-male or anti-female. In order to talk about the previous study, the one with the funky little abstract bit, I would want to see them categorize it for, like, male versus female interaction with provocative abstracts, rather than arguing that it's just men. But that, again, that's the previous study, and that's the abstract here. But I want to talk a lot about what this study said, because it is ridiculous, right? So, I have to go through this fun bit again, because they kind of
buried the lead again.
Buried the lead in this one as well, but it's not as bad. It's not intentional. It's just a little bit ridiculous in terms of their setup. So what they did was they sent out 63 and 64 resumes. They sent it to 6 different schools. They didn't control for any geography, right? And that matters. Geography matters because they measured pay. So if they had a slight distribution difference between male and female students, they said that there was, like, the average that the labs would pay was like $30,000 for these people to be hired.
Oh, so there could be that could be a huge factor. I mean, if you're looking
It
at a
could be,
lab
right?
in the L.A. metro area, say, as compared to the Dallas metro area, you're going to be looking
Right.
at
Huge differences
monumentally
in
different
pay.
costs of living, and
Right.
the necessity of a higher wage just to just to cover deprecation, right?
Right, and you're talking about it being different faculty members in different departments, right? So they actually sent it out to a bunch of different. They think they sent it out
So
to
it wasn't even
chemistry.
really well controlled.
Well, that's a really tough question to answer. So on one hand, yes, it's actually a really interesting concept. It's a really interesting study design. They just are grossly underpowered for what they need to be, right? So I actually, when I go through a lot of these studies, some of these things are brilliantly constructed, but they just don't send out enough to enough of what they need to do.
So basically, a lot of this, I mean, really, these things come in as really more than anything preliminary findings. It sounds like, and they're just running with it when they should,
they should be spending a lot more time
and get a lot more data to back it up.
Yes,
and then then as we were just discussing this, the second one went to actually go into that, and they invalidated the data.
Right, and that's one of the big problems that you see in the replication crisis is it's just underpowered stuff. So you go into this Mossacusen et al., which is this big honking study kicking everybody around, and buried in their materials and methods section, they say, additionally, in keeping with recommended practices, we conducted an a priori power analysis. So we have 63 and 64, right? That low N values, really low N values, pushing to like. Craig will hop on and talk about.
If you're trying to speak for all of society, 120 people is a really grossly inadequate number.
Comparing two groups of 63 individuals each is a gross misstatement, right? So their argument is that they conducted so prior to actually doing the study, they did an a priori power analysis to determine the optimal sample size needed to detect effects without biasing results toward obtaining significance. So, and then they say, thus, although our sample size may appear small to some readers, it is important to note that we obtained the necessary power and representativeness to generalize from our results while purposefully avoiding an unnecessary large sample that could have biased our results toward a false positive type 1 error. That's a weird concept, right?
Yeah, that strikes me as
You're
odd.
saying,
it's like they're trying to avoid having a sample set large enough to invalidate the data that they want to get, or they're trying to avoid getting the answer they don't want, right?
Yes, that's exactly what that reads as to me.
Okay.
And that it is amazing that it made it through peer review, and it is amazing that it got published on PNOS, and it is amazing that everybody sat there and went, 63 samples, look at the bias. Right? That is exactly what it reads like. They said, hey, it is important to note that we obtain the necessary power and representatives to generalize from our results. So again, they're generalizing from a very, very limited subset, and we're going to go into what that is, while purposefully avoiding an unnecessarily large sample that could have biased our results toward a false positive type 1 error. That is...
I mean, that sounds kind of antithetical to any kind of science.
It does. It does. They're basically arguing that they don't want to take a really large sample size because it might invalidate their theory.
I mean,
that's what it's saying.
So this is a toddler sticking their fingers in their ears and going, la, 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 la. No, I won't listen.
Yep.
Except scientifically, with big fancy words.
Now, here's the thing I think most of your listeners, when we're talking about general audience stuff, that they're going to start laughing hysterically at it. So, here is what they did. Participants were asked to provide feedback on the materials of an undergraduate science student who had stated their intention to go on to grad school and who had recently applied to a science laboratory manager position. An undergraduate student with zero experience applying to be the manager of a laboratory.
Okay, so let's put this into really simple terms because that should be understandable. But let's just say this: you walked up to the car dealership and said, "I'd like to manage all of these people, please."
Yes,
I'm not so much worried about the cars. They can sell the cars. I want to be in charge of the people selling the cars.
yes,
go ahead and do that
that
for
is
me.
exactly that is you sitting there and quitting your McDonald's job and going on down there and saying, "Yep, I've been I've got 4 years of burger flipping experience. I am ready to be a manager." It is ridiculous on its face. And that's what they actually did. That was what this Moss, Recuse, et al. Study. That's what this big, huge thing, this proof of bias in STEM was this. We're going to send a resume of an undergrad to a laboratory manager position,
So
and then have
that's
everybody.
the key. That's the key test here.
That is the key test, right?
Oh my!
And
Wow.
this is not sent to an actual laboratory, right? This is sent to professors who are managing a variety of different departments, right? It's chemistry and it's biology, chemistry, and physics departments. So a biology, chemistry, and physics professor is supposed to provide feedback on everything from the hireability to the likability to the pay that these students should receive in geographically different areas. There's only 6 different areas that they have tried for, with only 63 possible choices, and they're evaluating for a science laboratory manager position. And you know that it was not like one faculty member gets 2 of these things. So it's different people having different values for this, and they didn't want to have a large sample size with all of this variability built in, just to avoid not, invalidating the result.
I mean, this sounds
And this
exactly
is
like polling. Really. I mean, well, targeted polling, I should say, when you have an answer you need to get and you need a poll to back it up.
right. Yes, that would be accurate.
Oh, that's dirty.
This is the replication crisis. This is what's ended up happening is they'll have people that'll take this and they'll say, "Hey, there's a ton of bias in STEM," and it's based on a paper that has has a sample of 63 that broke it down into 63 and 64 male versus female, sent it out to 6 different universities, and asked an absurd question that makes no sense to anybody who is a real functioning adult.
I think I can break this down into some very simple terms. I actually worked in polling for a while, so I think I think this will make a lot of sense and be a very understandable concept. When you're doing the calls with your survey for the Fraternal Order of Police, next president, what's your favorite bread, what liquors do you recognize from commercials, you start out asking questions. You ask, may I speak with the man of the house, the woman of the house? Well, you're already starting from a weighted perspective because you're looking for something particular. If you
Right.
ever get into the business of polling and you're kind of on the ground floor and you've got a mind about you, you'll really notice. There's almost any given survey or poll, there is a very specific target demographic. Even if they're not telling you, you'll notice who it is that you don't proceed with the surveys on. Now, sometimes it's as simple as that specific demographic has been filled, but sometimes it's that they don't really want to fill particular demographics. And when that happens, you get answers that are... Now, you expect certain answers from certain types of people, and you will get them. You're going to have deviation, but you can kind of wager on certain things coming from certain groups in certain percentages. And it sounds like we've got the very same issue in science as we do in polling.
It's
or
similar.
Not very same, but we've got the same kind of fuckery.
Well, I think a lot of this has to do with a complete misunderstanding of statistics, right? So they turn around and they did all this. They said they did an 9 priority study, and they found that the they need X number of participants, and that's what they got. Well, here's how this breaks down, right? So they broke it into two groups, male and female, right, for their resumes. One group of male resumes and one group of female resumes. They had 6 different universities. One's a public sector and one's a private sector, but let's say 6 universities. So take your sample size of 63-ish applicants and break it down by 6. So now you have 10 applicants per each category. On each dimension there, and then you turn around and you break it one down further, that you have, of these 10 applicants in these 10 categories, they're going to 3 different departments, which means that the entirety of their research is essentially 3 people, or three resumes for each, male, female, whatever, from each university, each department. Kind of their sample size is essentially a value of 3. And that's the problem that you have when you start talking about the power, the statistical power that you have, is for every group size, right? For every category that you're doing. And they did ANOVA.
When you're getting to a group that small, you can very specifically tailor, because, it's X, Y, and Z individual. So you can just,
right.
You've got the dossier on that particular person. It's like, what they're going to say about certain things. So, you're... Boy, that's that's some dirty pool.
You can look at it as dirty and intentional. I think there could be some legitimacy to that, but I think it's actually just a misnomer for statistics, right? The problem that you have is that when you start talking about sample sizes, every single category needs to, like, if you determine that you need 63 people to properly generate a viable sample size, that would be 63 with each and every category. Right, so let's say so how many categories do we have? Well, we have male versus female. That's 2, right? This is divided among 6 different universities, so that's 2 times 6. So you need 12 times as many people as you thought that you would need, and then 3 departments. So you need 36 times whatever statistical size you need to detect a meaningful thing. And they're sitting there and they're saying, well, I can detect a meaningful thing on 60 some odd people. Well, that may be true. But in reality, when you toss in all of these known variables, like physics and biology and chemistry, they do not pay the same for their laboratory individuals, right? They don't pay the same for those fields don't pay the same. Physics pays higher than chemistry. Chemistry pays higher than biology, right? These are actual variables that we know are going to be impacting this, right? If you start talking about having this 2 times 6 times 2 times 6 times 3, or this factor of 36 times, that means that you need 36 times 63 studies in order to get a viable result. So in reality, they're underpowered by a factor of 36, and you can sit there and say, hey, this is intentional. I don't try to read in malintent. I think that's an incorrect way to do it. It's just a whole bunch of people who are really, like, psychologists are just terrible at math. That's not how you do statistics. That's really what it comes down to. So they might have been able to get by with 63, but they would have to have 63 for each sample case, and they didn't have that. And they said, okay, well, the end result is that you're only testing for 3 in each of these categories, and this is known as a that's how ANOVA testing goes. Is you're supposed to basically figure out what your pool is and then multiply that out where you can detect a difference between them. You're supposed to multiply that out by the number of categories that you have, and they didn't do that. That's the problem that they have. And then it's ridiculous, right? Like, undergraduate student going for laboratory manager position, totally ridiculous. So this is the kind of stuff that you start seeing, and you find these things all the time. Like I rip apart. I don't do it as much anymore because I've gotten kind of bored with Twitter. Social media is getting exhausting, especially in this year. But this is one of the things. You start talking about the replication crisis, and people are going, well, what does it matter? And well, the answer is that you're not actually getting viable results. You're not getting any. You're sitting there and taking the mantle of science without understanding what it means to be a science, right? That's an issue. That's a problem. Like, this is a big deal that you're like, the people who are generating, radical changes in materials, in physics, in it, they're sitting there and trying to take and say, hey, I did this sample with 63 people who are walking out of an undergraduate program and applying for a manager position at a lab, right? this is not how that works, right?
It's kind of unrealistic.
It's unrealistic, right? And I think that this is an ivory tower phenomenon, right? Like, these are people that do not work in the real world. They do not understand how the real world works.
Well, as they say, those who can do, those who cannot teach.
Right. The Ghostbusters cover this really well. Dan Aykroyd and the crew get fired from the university, and they walk out and they're like, oh my God, what are we going to do? We're paranormal investigators, right? And Dan Aykroyd turns around and goes, you've never been in the private sector. They expect results. And I think that's the thing, is that you start talking about the academic science, the academia. Academia has no expectation of results. They don't have to get it right. And because they don't have to get it right, they're happy to get it wrong. Because at the end of the day, it's not about whether or not you got a correct result. It's not whether your result was replicable. It's how many pieces of paper you wrote. And in that regard, if you have $100,000 and it costs you, and you get 3 pieces of paper out the door for that $100,000 versus one really good piece of paper, guess which one looks better? The person who wrote 3 papers on $100,000 or the person who wrote 1 paper on $100,000?
So
it's a perverted system.
So what is science kind of akin to YouTube now? Just whoever gets the just put out the most churn, even if the content's garbage.
Yeah, that's kind of how it works.
Oh, great! So science is running on an algorithm.
Yeah, it is. And you start talking about where do we start seeing these things a lot. You talked a little bit last time about the group that published a bunch of studies and grievance studies. This has been going on for a little while. There was the Sokol affair, right? And Sokol was decided to attack the postmodern cultural studies, and he sent just nonsense in it. Turns out they publish it because it agrees with what they want. Even though he's supposed to be going through peer review, it doesn't. He pushes back just a little bit, and they put nonsense out there. And these are kind of the problems that you have. So you say, okay, right, I picked on psychology enough, so I'm going to move on from psychology a little bit. Plus, I'm slowly closing out the tabs that I had opened for this project. And you start looking around and you say, okay, so how bad is this, right? And the upside is that most people don't have to be worried about science. It's not, their phone isn't going to stop working because the laws of physics are unraveling. There's only a handful of fields where this is getting to be problematic, and we can start talking about those fields. Yes, there you go. That's a good one, right?
Yeah, I'm putting that there for notes, so I'll make sure and link up something about the Sokol hoax so that people can read up on that. It's absolutely fascinating read.
Yep, and Sokol did it in like 1996 before the joy of the internet. Oh, that might be the same thing. This is the new one,
actually, that happened more recently.
I think I closed out Sokol's thing.
Although this does go into the brief when it was in the late 90s, Alan Sokol and NYU.
Yep. Yeah, well, and that was a big thing because I think he went into and he said something like gravity is racist and all this ridiculous nonsense. And then they decided as professors to go forward with it. So let's see here. What do I got? I've already done Yol-Inbar. I'm looking at my notes here. I did Yol-Inbar. I covered most of the replication crisis. So let's talk about where this is coming into effect. You're free to stop me here if you feel this is diving too political. I'm not trying to be political. This is just where do you start to see these things crop up, right? So it's not really apparent in a lot of physics. It is rampant in the social sciences. I've already covered 6 papers on it so far, a couple different discussions. I've covered textbooks. So it's pretty rampant there. So
well, no, at this point we're being just entirely factual.
Right, I mean, and that's what I'm trying to.
It just is. It's I
yep.
mean, take it for what you will, but I mean, this is just it. Just is. This is how it is. I mean, you can be
And
upset at the blueness of the sky, but it's still blue.
well, and that's kind of the thing. If anybody, if anybody wants to disagree with me, I'm more than open to having a fair and honest discussion about it. But at the end of the day, I basically, if somebody has a political position that they are attempting to support, they link me a scientific paper, I can rip it apart in 10 minutes or less, because it doesn't take very long. So touching on psychology again, I saw somebody who sat there and tried to prove that Donald Trump was elected due to racism, and he links this paper, and the paper starts off, and these are other things that you'll find. They'll start off, and it looks like they must, before they ever went out to collect results, they already wrote the paper, and they didn't change anything in the paper. So the paper finds out that makes this argument that that it's a whole bunch of people who are upset about cultural relevance and white and blah blah blah. It's a bunch of nonsense, right? And it turns out that the predominant issue, with all of the metrics that they show in the paper, the predominant issue that Trump won on is China, right? It wasn't immigration. That was actually, like, he was equidistant from the Democrats. The Democrats and the Republicans were equidistant on that from where the majority of the people they polled were. But when it came down to dealing with China, Donald Trump was, like, right on the money with what the majority of Americans believe. Hold on just a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, that's actually that's quite cogent, because say what you will about white supremacy or a return to tradition. I mean, it's clear to anyone that the situation of the world today, not even necessarily specifically today, with what might be argued to be a bioweapon unleashed from Chinese labs burning through the world. That's neither here nor there. Not even that part of the whole thing. I mean, China has basically become the world's manufactory. And that is, it's not unsustainable. It's quite sustainable. It's just horrifyingly unhealthy for anyone that isn't China.
Well, and that's essentially what the paper found in its actual data. But then it still concluded with this whole, it's the white people being forced out, and it's ridiculous nonsense. So what you're getting is two fronts, right? You're getting this political side of things that's coming in and just saying, hey, I have this great theory. Let's not let the data get in the way of the theory. And you can see that in the paper that we just talked about. What was that? It's getting late, so I'm getting a little bit foggy.
Or in
Ross
the immortal
McHugh's
words of Rahm Emanuel, you can't let a crisis go to waste.
Right, exactly. That's kind of what we're starting to see in science, is a lot of people who have a lot of really strong opinions are writing a paper and then throwing a hissy fit about it when people say, hey, this is bullshit, and here's why. And they go, well, you can't just disagree with science, and this is the scientism. So what you have is you're running into this thing where you have one side of the political aisle running around saying that everybody on the other side of the political aisle is a denier. They're denying science, right? So even though this stuff doesn't replicate, and even though you can rip it apart in like 10 minutes, and even though the papers themselves invalidate the theory that they're pushing,
if you read deep enough,
if you read beyond the abstract, right? Like you gotta move on to page 2. If you can't get to page 2, don't have a comment or an opinion on the piece. Even though all of that's true, they're sitting there and trying to take the mantle of science, because the mantle of science is so powerful. It's motivated so many people. It has enriched the lives of us and everybody across the world. Science is the greatest achievement of the last 2,000 years. It actually solidifying the process. And here you have a whole bunch of people who want all the credit without doing any of the work. Right?
And
so
they're starting to get salty and tell us that we need to decolonize.
Well, yeah, that's that. So when I started looking around, I started trying to find out what other fields is this rampant in, right? So it's rampant in social psychology. It's rampant in sociology. The social sciences, they're just hosed. You start talking about oncology research, and that actually has a slightly higher up. I think that actually gets into the 90s of percentages. But that's because it's really hard to make a drug and then test it on 10 people, right? Because we're getting into we're running into the point where the low hanging fruit of science is gone. It's just we've gotten there, right? There's nothing easy to do. So as these things get harder and harder, we are not increasing the burden. We aren't maintaining the same burden of proof. We're getting a little bit more lax in our methods. We have a whole bunch of people who are doing statistical procession without having any knowledge of actual statistics. We have a bunch of people who are not designing actual experiments, and we're running into problems. So where else do we see this? And the answer for me was climate change. So you actually go to my YouTube channel for the few people who do, outside of those who are really interested in plaster. You go to my YouTube channel, and I have a lot of stuff on climate change. And again, this is all because of the same premise. This is all because
the plaster video will be linked below.
I will link the plaster video. Maybe we can push that. I don't know how many people watch your podcast. Maybe we can push that up even higher, and then I can just be like, shake my head a little bit more.
No worries. I'll get you another 8 views on there.
That's awesome.
So click on through.
It's an amazing thing to see everybody look. Yeah. So you start talking about climate change, and climate change was, so 2008 was when I graduated, and I start looking around and having my own little internal crisis, because science, something that I believed and held true, was no longer valid. So what was really valid? And I decided to dig into climate change because, 2008, 2009 recession, wonderful time to be alive. Also a lot of free time for most of us that had graduated in that year. A lot of free time, a lot more free time than we ever wanted, a lot less money than we wanted. So what do you have to do but to go read papers and do research? And that's what I did. And I started digging into climate change because, I believed in it. I believed in it as a theory and as a premise. But there were certain things that were starting to stick out to me. I saw a lot of people starting to do name calling. That's really weird when you see people who are doing name calling. It's the same kind of thing that I pulled out when people are sitting there and saying, hey, this is problematic that you don't automatically accept this on face value. It's the same thing when you start seeing people who are raising questions about climate change, and they're getting called deniers. Well, I didn't see him deny anything. I saw him say, hey, how did you get that? I think you forgot to carry the 2 there. like that's what a lot of the early stuff in the 2008, 2009, it's all political now. So I generally don't follow the skeptic channels as much as I should. Or any of it anymore, because I got sick and tired of it. But it was really in the early days in 08, 09, it was a lot of this, hey, I just pulled out this paper, and it turns out that that's not what you get from that data set. And if I go pull this data set over here, that's not what I see. And this becomes a constant problem within that field. And I have a paper here that we're going to talk about a little bit, because there's certain things that red pill you, so to speak, in the instant. It just immediately changes your worldview on how the world works. And we talked a little bit about, again, we talked about IQ studies a little bit. I didn't really dive into it, but having the dean stand there in the classroom and walk me through, or have to comfort the class, as we talked about, ethnic differences in IQ, and didn't show up for Carol Gilligan's lecture. That it stands out to you, right?
Certainly.
The same thing starts to appear in climate change, and I start to see these. I remember basically one of the points the skeptics made is, hey, if we look at this trend between 1998 and today, it's significantly lower than the projected trend over the same time, right? It's a third as much, and if we carry this difference out, the actual final outcome of our global average temperature is radically different. And down here it's not really a problem, and up here it's a problem. And even if we accept everything about it being a problem at temperature X, if we don't ever hit temperature X, it doesn't fucking matter, right? And that's what we're dealing with on the climate skeptic side. and you start seeing the same kind of thing. It's all about the narrative. They're pushing, where psychology is out there sitting there and talking about a sample. They're trying to sit there and broadcast a sample of, 18 to 24-year-old college graduates from Ivy League institutions as reflective of the general populace. Climate scientists are doing the same thing, where they ran a mathematical model with a whole series of assumptions in it, and they got this result, and therefore that's the reality. Because the problem that climate has, where psychology has an issue of ethics, right, where you say anything, you give informed consent, and you change the outcome, so they've kind of like cheapened up the issue there. Climate has another issue where it takes a really, really long time to make a judgment on climate. So how do you keep this field? The actual definition of climate is like a 30-year span of climate data. A year, nothing's going to change between 2008 and 2009. There should be nothing that changes in that year. Now, between 2008 and 2038, we might get a little bit of change, but we're still only talking about 1 unit of climate between those two things, because climate is defined as a 30-year period of essentially the weather. So you start talking about these people, and they're projecting out 80 to 100 years. And I don't know about you, but I am inherently skeptical when somebody wants to make a prediction about the future. I just am, because I can't prove it.
All I'll say on this matter is that it breaks my heart to this very day when I think back to that fateful day 8 years ago, when New York City was swallowed up by the oceans. I cry every night that I think back to all the poor souls we lost in NYC when those waves just crashed down and engulfed all of New York City. Took my breath away. I can't believe it actually happened 8 years ago.
Or, the ice pack melting, or any one of these other things, right? And so what's ended up happening is they switched over.
Just think of the lasers that are coming in from the sun through the hole in the ozone that didn't heal at all.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Well, one of the problems that you have
fluorofluorocarbons. Go on.
Yeah. One of the problems you have with environmental science is everything's a crisis. And we have no point of reference for that crisis. So they take a look up, and they notice that a plant is blue, and they go, "Oh my God, I didn't know that plant was blue." Well, it could have been blue forever, or it could have a periodic blooming, but we just really weren't paying attention for the past, couple hundred years. So we don't really have a data.
It could be said that we don't have a good data set for climate, in the same way that we kind of were lacking a good data set for these other studies we had just discussed.
Right, and that's the big problem. And as you go back further and further in time in climate, the data happens to get worse and worse and worse. And climate needs to be evaluated over a longer and longer period of time. So you're dealing with these same kind of data issues. And I actually give climatologists a little bit more credit than I do psychologists, because they have tried really, really hard to fix it. The only problem is that there's open questions as to whether you can fix data or not. Can you really do something? Can you add information that's not really there? And we can make the argument that AI can do it and all this other thing, but it's the same thing as if I go take if I have a security camera and I blow up an image, there's only a certain resolution that I can blow it up to, right? Because there's just not that information there. I can make the argument that I can add all of this information in, which is kind of what they're doing, but the problem is that it may or may not be true. And this is a constant issue that you start seeing in a couple different papers. And I'm actually going to link one here where this became abundantly clear to me. And I was like, this paper deeply offends me, right? And I've seen, I've actually presented it to a whole bunch of people who were very much believers, and they had a full reversal. Some people have tried to defend it, but it doesn't. So I'm going to go down, and if you go to page 10 of this paper here, and it's this
Just to note, this
Trent
paper
Berthier,
came out in 2008.
2009.
Well, it says in final form 29th July 2008, so it must have
Fair
been
enough.
reviewed for a year and then blah. But nonetheless.
Probably. So it's 2000, 2008, 2009, but the point it is older, but the point is kind of made. So if you go to page 10, and I actually this one is so jarring that I tend to remember the actual page, and you go to the upper right hand corner of this page, and you start reading through this whole entire thing, you get down to about midway in the first paragraph, and it says, thus, while the spread of various values provides some measure of agreement, it generally greatly overestimates the uncertainty we can assign to our best estimates. Therefore, we have a lot more confidence in the values we have assigned than indicated by the spread within the tables. TOA values are known within about plus or minus 3% or better, except that the net is or was 0.85 plus or minus 0.15 watts per square meter. Hansen et al. 2005, and solar fluxes, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know if you can catch that, right? I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist here. They have turned around and made a value judgment. So what they did with this whole entire thing is they
let me
had
see if I can put this
set...
into a little bit more. Let me see if my layman mind is understanding it correctly. What they've done is they, quote unquote, lack confidence in the values that were derived from actual hard science, and therefore felt the greater value was in the data that they essentially made up.
The actual data that they used comes from a model. So they went out there with this thing called the Sirius satellite.
So
they
from data that a computer
the
made
Sirius satellite data with modeling data. That's what they did. They literally took data of the theoretical data calculated from their personal, what they think should be happening, and they said, I don't like what the Sirius satellite is spitting out. I don't like the uncertainty that the Sirius satellite is giving us. So we didn't measure this, but this is what we have assigned. And you can actually go up to the table, and they have changed the values from what they expected to this new stuff that they've assigned. And
so essentially,
the kicker,
it's completely valueless.
Say it again?
Largely here, this is essentially a valueless. There's nothing really here.
That's what it comes off as to me, right? I mean, you might be able to argue that there's all this other stuff, but if they turn around and they decided that if
the hard numbers you're getting from the instruments doing the measuring don't meet your ideological demands, that doesn't really change the hard numbers.
Well, and that's kind of that. I don't know whether it's because they didn't meet the ideological demands or because basically they turn around and they got sticker shock, right? They look at this thing and they're expecting to see X, Y, or Z. They take the most sensitive measurement device that we have to do this with, right, which is the Sirius satellite. And I actually, when I read this paper, I went in and pulled from NASA the Sirius satellite data and its calibration capabilities and what it was at. It is very sensitive. It is to a fraction of what it is. The problem is that what you end up having from this is the effect that we have as a quote-unquote greenhouse effect is at best a rounding error. The actual magnitude of the energy coming in and the energy going out is so great, and the uncertainties with it is so high that when we go to measure it, we can't prove the theory. That's the issue. And so they decided that they went in and they were going to prove the theory using the most sensitive instrument we have. It turns out we can't do that, so they decided to substitute the theory instead of reality. And this is actually not the first time I saw this, right? So the whole, what causes you to go down this road and even investigate in the first path? I was going to argue with my father, who was a skeptic as well. And I was all set to prove it to him because I found this great paper that was on the original Argo buoy data set. And for those who don't know, the Argo buoys is how we measure the data in the oceans. We basically put out a whole bunch of floats. It drops the probe all the way down to as low as the probe can go, and it samples the data all throughout that water column. So we get an idea of the amount of energy in there, the salt intake, and all this other stuff. And so the initial Argo buoy data that came up showed that the temperature of the Earth was actually either stable or declining. And that, like, it was funny because they said, we know what's really going on. We don't know why this is happening, why we're getting this result. So we have this multi-million-dollar temperature probe, and we're going to assume that's wrong. And that was the first time I was like, wait, what?
Just out of curiosity, would that have been where a lot of the initial push for the next ice age is coming? Would that have been where that came from? Just out of curiosity, more than anything else.
No. So the Argo buoy data set came about in like 2006.
Oh, okay. So
we launched it in roughly 2001. Yeah, it's really recent. So we had the XBAT system prior to this. XBAT was essentially a probe that communicated through a wire to the back of the boat. And so when we start talking, whenever you see, so if you see the stuff on climate that says, oh yeah, look at the ocean warming, because that's what they've tried to switch to, because atmospheric warming hasn't worked out so well. So they moved over to ocean warming, and they say, oh, look at all this ocean warming. Well, it turns out we don't really have that data going back too far. Anything pretty much prior to 1998 is bullshit. So the Argo buoy system is a very good representative sampling system. It is designed to do what it does. The previous system was the XBAT probes, and we would basically drop these off a boat. They'd descend into the ocean. They'd take data measurements along the way, send it up along a wire, and we measure it at the back of the ship. And then prior to that, they had this system where they were sampling water intakes on ships, and prior to that, they actually were sampling a bucket that the people would throw over the side and take up. So, obviously massive changes to how we measure the problem. And we get a lot of really cool results from that, but it also means that we can't really mesh it very well as we go back in time. So what you get is what ends up happening again is you'll get this graph, and it's a very nice graph, and it shows you how radically the temperature's gone up. Well, that's based like solely off the buoy data at a certain point, and everything prior to that point, prior to the temperature rise in the ocean, right? That's all modeling data. So you see...
okay, so a lot of the models for previous activity are based on this current information, relatively current information.
No, so they splice the data, the actual data they have, to a model, and it looks like they have longer representation than they really do. Right. One of the I wrote a small little paper on ocean acidification. Actually, I wrote two. One I made a mistake on. There was an error in my MathCAD file, and then I corrected that, and it fixed itself out a little bit. But I was responding to this claim that if you go back to the like 1700s or something like that, I'm sure you've heard of ocean acidification.
Only heard
right?
It. I couldn't say more, but yeah, I've heard
the idea is that increasing CO2 in the atmosphere is driving it. There's a whole series of equilibrium balances between atmospheric CO2 and going all the way down to like your carbonates, which precipitate out in the ocean. And so if we increase atmospheric CO2, then technically if we were to only change atmospheric CO2, that would change everything throughout the cycle all the way down to your carbonates. Technically, okay. The opposite is true too, though, right? So if anything changed in the ocean chemistry, it would actually result in an increase in CO2 above the Earth's atmosphere. So it's technically a bifurcated system, but the assumption is that the only influence on the system is humans' influence. That's a huge assumption, considering how little we know about the ocean, but it is the assumption, right?
Okay.
And when you go through this, they say, hey, we've detected pH back to like, or, if you look at a map of the pH back to like 1700, look at this radical change. Well, hold on for a moment. pH wasn't invented until like 1928. Like the concept, we had no way of measuring pH prior to 1928. And I assure you, it wasn't a very good system, and it wasn't shipborne until like the 1940s. Right? So they're going back to 1700, and it's all modeling data all the way back.
Well,
and so this,
if I'm to tie that to something that people are going to be able to appreciate, the initial models for COVID deaths in the U.S. were well over 1 million.
right?
And
Yep.
And this was just based on bad data sets. And I mean,
Yes.
not to shortchange it, and not to belittle anyone who's lost someone they love, but I mean, it's not as bad as we were expecting, and a lot of that is to do with we had shitty data.
Yes. And that's absolutely correct. It goes back to the same thing that psychology has, is it has a tendency to oversample left-leaning college students on a left-leaning campus within the United States, right? It's a problem. It's a problem that's kind of probably universal in most sciences, but
And it's even a bit of a self-perpetuating cycle.
It is, right? So if you don't take the data result, if you don't go after that shitty data, you don't publish a result. If you don't get a result published, you can't get more data. So what do? You take a cheap shitty halfway through process, and then you try to deal with the consequences. This is I really
science.
What's that?
That is just bad science.
It is. It's bad science.
That's not even lazy science. That's bad science.
Well, yes, but the question is, how could we do it better? And that's a much harder question than I think a lot of people understand, right? So I agree that it's bad science. I think that there should be a full, take everything we say with a grain of salt disclaimer. But on the other hand, these are real issues that we should be studying. My issue is that the scientists aren't openly acknowledging how bad the data is. So, and these are the things that you end up seeing. So you see this substitution of that, and you also see things like I think the Zeke Housefather paper that came out recently. He basically turned around and said climate models are really good, right? They're based on physics. As long as we put in the actual values of what actually occurred, and you pause for a moment and you say, wait a minute. So the criticism that skeptics leveled was that the climate models are bad because the results were bad, and you're saying that no, our models are great, our assumptions were wrong, and you think that that's an improvement. And that's kind of the issue that you have in these things, is they're so wrapped up in the axle with their argument and their perspective that they aren't really taking a moment to step back and say, hey, yeah, this doesn't make any sense what we're doing. We're going to sit there and ask somebody to evaluate, using only 63 samples. We're going to evaluate the difference between men and women on, a laboratory management position for an undergraduate student, right? This is absurd. Everything about this is absurd, and nobody's taking a step back and saying, hey, yeah, this is actually absurd.
No, that's a fair argument.
Right.
Although I would say that the whole discussion of climate change, I mean, it's probably worthy of its own, discussion in and of itself.
Oh, I agree totally. So I'm only going, I would love to, and this is something that I would want to throw in with Craig here, because I think this is, get as many minds in the pot as you can.
Yeah, this would be a good one for a roundtable. I'll have to see what I can work up about that, because I imagine a number of folks would be interested to hear a number of different viewpoints on this where they aren't yelling at each other.
Well, and that's kind of the thing. Like, I'm so tired. I've basically muted all of climate Twitter because they're annoying. Both the people, and I'm not saying that as like this is only the people who are pro climate change. Both people on both sides are incredibly annoying. I got sick and tired of having 240 notifications between the time I went to bed and the time I woke up in the morning. And all of it is name calling between the two sides. It is so irritating. There is legitimate criticism and legitimate science on both sides, and I think that that kind of discussion is something that's necessary. But the last paper, and I think this is the last one I'm going to go into for the night, and this talks a little bit about, and this is again on climate, but there is the question comes up of, is it deniers? Are you actually denying science? And so there was a group run by Frank Janko and a few others. And I'll link the Judith Curry article because she highlighted it.
And if I could interject, a great man named Richard Feynman once said, "Scientists love mysteries. Scientists
Yes, they do.
love not knowing." And it seems like a lot of that ethos is kind of gone.
If I could play Feynman's like 1930s lecture or 1960s lecture in Cornell, I can't remember which one it was, where he goes through the scientific method on a loop in a science class, I think that it totally would. I would love it. First we guess it, then we compute the consequences of the guess, and then we test that against experiment. If it fails its experiment, it's wrong. Right? I don't know if you've seen that video.
I actually have not. I just have great respect for Feynman. He's a singular mind. And
I will link that, because that is without a doubt he is. I used to think that I was big into Einstein, but I realized that Feynman is my homeboy. Here we go. This is.
Well, you have the
the
Virgin Einstein and the Chad Feynman, as it were.
No, well, I mean, Einstein was a sex pervert in every single way that there is to be a sex pervert. But yeah,
I wouldn't know, but I wouldn't be surprised at all.
What? But so the last paper that I linked, and I linked the Feynman video. You should watch that. It's fantastic. Absolutely, without a doubt, watch it. I'll probably watch it after this because I love watching it.
We'll make sure and drop it in the links for anybody that wants to check that out.
I did. I linked it to you.
Yeah, it'll be there.
So the last paper that I'm going to talk about tonight is a paper that Judith Curry talked about, and it has to do with evaluating the difference between the NIPCC and the IPCC. Now, the IPCC is your general climate body. That's what the international. It's the UN International Panel on Climate Change. The NIPC is the non-governmental panel on climate change, right? They're just they're being them, right? And so somebody decided they were going to go tackle this issue, and they were going to destroy the folks that are pushing out the report. What they found out when they looked at it is that essentially there is a fundamental difference between what information skeptics are evaluating and what information the non-skeptics are evaluating, right?
Okay.
And the short of it is that the debate between the two sides, if you take a sociology of science approach, is essentially the exact same debate that's occurring across all of the sciences. What is it that we are? What is it? What are our sources of knowledge? How valuable are those sources of knowledge, and how should we weight them? And when you start talking about the folks who are skeptics, they have a tendency to weight paleo studies and put like zero emphasis on modeling studies. And on the opposite side of things, they're putting their effort into modeling studies rather than the actual physical data. And so now we're in this unique stage as we go forward through the replication crisis of trying to determine which epistemological view is correct. Is it better to have science that is based off of that theory of induction, the problem of induction, which is what our models are, right? We've decided how we're going to construct them, what information we're putting into it ahead of time, and that determines our result. Or is it better to look around us and deduce from that what is actually going on. And that is the thought that I kind of want to leave this at, because that's really the debate of, that's really the issue with the replication crisis. It is the problem of induction versus deduction. And some people believe that they can derive the answer from what they already know, and other people believe that the only way we could find an answer is by exploring the unknown.
Well,
and it's kind of tough to figure out.
That's not a bad place to kind of wrap things up.
Yeah.
Actually, suffice it to say, it's really better to ask the question, and it's always better to have more data. Always.
Yes.
So with that,
well, and what we're finding is, as time goes on, we are finding that there is starting to be, we built all these models. We thought we were really smart, but as time goes on, it turns out the empirical data is starting to diverge with our theoretical data in psychology, in sociology, in climate, and that is really what the replication crisis is about.
Yeah, you have to be. You have to be unafraid of being wrong. Kind of everywhere in your life if you want to really succeed. Because if you trap yourself in these intellectual prisons, they're hard to get out. And they get even harder to get out when you find other people that are of similar mind. Crabs in a bucket, if you will. But with that said, we'll call it at this, and we'll see you all again soon. Thanks for coming along and having this conversation. And
always happy to do so.
You want to have anybody take a look at?
Nothing in particular. Like I said, my most popular video is the.
Oh, no worries. The plaster video will absolutely be linked below. So make sure and watch that twice.
Yes.
Thumbs up. Thumbs down at first, and then thumbs up it, and then comment, and then subscribe.
Yeah, that's the way to go. All you're gonna do is end up having me be incredibly more confused than I already am. It's a fascinating thing.
Well, as they say though, scientists love mysteries, so that'll be perfect. So
they do
that.
Indeed.
All right, it's been a pleasure, everybody. Have a great evening, morning, whatever it is, wherever it is, whenever it is, and talk to you again soon.